Hi, everybody. Tonight we begin a long and winding tale, a journey through velvet halls and the scent of rotting power, where the flickering candlelight of England's Tudor court casts long shadows over one of its most formidable kings, Henry VIII. His name is often whispered alongside gluttony, tyranny, and 6 ill-fated wives. But what fewer know, what fewer dare speak of, is how the great monarch met his strange and grotesque end. This story is not only about his bizarre death, but about the subtle decline, the quiet unraveling of a man once worshipped as nearly divine. It is about courtly deceit, whispered prayers, aching regret, and the long echo of a dying king who would not go gently. Over the next 24 parts, we'll uncover it all. Let's begin our story at the height of splendor, not the end, for even death must wait its turn. In the year 1537, the great halls of Whitehall Palace pulsed with a kind of arrogant confidence, a certainty born from conquest and reform. Henry VIII sat upon his throne, not as a cautious monarch, but as an emperor in all but name. He was 46 years old, still powerful, still feared, his copper-colored beard streaked lightly with silver. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, now gleamed with suspicion and exhaustion. He had achieved much. England had torn itself from the grip of Rome. The monasteries had crumbled, their riches siphoned into the royal coffers. Enemies were crushed. And now, he had something he had waited years to hold, a legitimate male heir. Prince Edward, son of Jane Seymour, his third wife and, in Henry's private estimation, the only one who had truly done her duty. But even as the court toasted with French wines and lords scrambled to please the king, something deeper stirred beneath the surface, something frail. Henry was changing. He had once been a vigorous man, fond of tournaments and hunts, his muscular frame galloping across the English countryside. His enemies had called him a golden prince, a man of Renaissance learning and knightly valor. But years of injury, gluttony, and disease were quietly unraveling that image. Few at court knew the full extent of his suffering. Most were too afraid to look too closely. In 1536, the king had suffered a catastrophic jousting accident. His horse had crushed him, and the leg wound he sustained would never truly heal. The royal physicians, more alchemists than scientists, applied ointments and prayers. But the wound festered. It reopened again and again, stinking and weeping with infection. Courtiers began to notice a new scent about the king, sweet and rancid, rot. He still rode, but he could no longer mount a horse unaided. He still danced, but only in memory. He still ruled, but the throne was growing heavier. The mood within the palace shifted slowly, imperceptibly, like the tide. There were no announcements of illness, no royal proclamations of decline, but the silence was telling. Servants moved with hushed urgency. Physicians were called in secret. Henry, once the most photographed man of his age, his portraits declaring strength and control, stopped sitting for painters. Ambassadors wrote curious letters. One, from the imperial court, whispered of a change in gait and demeanor. Another noted the king's growing paranoia, his eyes darting behind him in crowded halls. He suspected plots everywhere. Once trusted friends were suddenly branded traitors. Even his closest advisors walked on eggshells. Thomas Cromwell, architect of the Reformation, began to take longer pauses before answering questions. And Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, prayed longer at night. They all saw it, but no one dared say it aloud. The king was unwell, yes, but he was also increasingly unpredictable. His mood swung violently, from affection to fury in the space of a breath. The pain in his leg made him irritable. His swelling body, so bloated that custom-made iron girdles were required to keep his frame upright, was a daily embarrassment. And beneath it all, deeper still, there was grief. Jane Seymour, his beloved queen, had died days after giving birth to Prince Edward. Henry had never recovered. He mourned her privately but obsessively. Her portrait hung over his bed. And as his health declined, he clung tighter to her memory, as if her spirit could protect his soul from what he feared was coming. Death. He had seen it too often, in wives, in friends, in rivals, and though he had ordered the deaths of so many, he feared his own more than anything. At night, he would lie awake. In the candlelit stillness of his chambers, between the rustle of bed linens and the occasional snore of a sleeping servant, Henry heard things. Voices, whispers. Sometimes he claimed it was God, other times Anne Boleyn, her ghost, accusing him, reminding him that he had sent her to the block. He told his chaplains to pray harder. He asked for relics from holy sites. He insisted on constant masses, even as he scorned the Pope. His contradictions piled like debts, and his sleep grew worse. As 1540 approached, the kingdom itself reflected its master's unease. The air of triumph had grown stale. The Reformation, once a wave of righteous rebellion, was now a battleground of factions. Protestants and Catholics fought in whispers and sermons, each trying to divine the king's mood, and Henry was alone. Even among courtiers, even among wives, there was no equal, no confidant, only fear. He had married Anne of Cleves in January 1540, a German princess whose portrait promised elegance and charm. But upon meeting her in person, Henry recoiled. He called her the Flanders mare. He claimed she smelled wrong. Their marriage was never consummated. It was annulled within 6 months, and so the king drifted further into himself. This was the beginning of the strange final act, the slow erosion of a titan, the hidden infections, the courtly deceptions, the dreams that haunted the royal mind like fever. And yet, no one outside the palace knew the full truth. To the world, King Henry VIII was still the powerful monarch who had bent an entire religion to his will. He was still the Lion of England, still the supreme head of the church. But behind the doors of Whitehall, a different truth lingered. The lion was limping. His kingdom, built upon pride and blood, was beginning to feel the cost of both. And so we leave him here for now, half shadowed in candlelight, dressed in fur and embroidered silk, sweating through the night, listening to ghosts. The strange end of Henry VIII had not yet arrived, but it was drawing nearer, like thunder over the hills, like rot beneath the skin. In the next part, we'll follow the quiet scheming that began as Henry's health declined, and how even in sickness, the king's appetite for power and vengeance never waned. As the year 1541 crept upon the Kingdom of England, the halls of Whitehall grew quieter. Not silent, but cautious. Conversations were muffled, laughter rehearsed, and footsteps carefully placed. The king, though still alive, had become a figure more looming than living. His presence no longer inspired confidence, only calculation. Henry VIII had now entered a period where his court was less a gathering of nobles and more a theater of masks. Behind every bow was a concealed motive. Behind every smile, a quiet fear. The king's deteriorating health had become the kingdom's best-kept secret, known to all and spoken of by none. In these twilight years, Henry's condition began to dictate the rhythm of court life. The days were scheduled around his unpredictable bouts of rage and melancholy. Physicians were summoned in clusters, offering leeching, poultices, and prayers. And when they could do no more, they offered silence. The king's leg was the worst of it. The old jousting wound had grown monstrous. It bulged and stank, festering beneath layers of linen and ointment. Sometimes it was so swollen that the royal surgeons had to lance it to relieve the pressure, causing Henry to howl like a beast in the night. This grotesque routine became almost ritual. Blood and pus were drawn as if they were sacred humors. The sick room stank of vinegar, sweat, and something darker, something unmistakably decaying. The king's bedclothes were changed frequently, yet the stench lingered in the chamber like a curse. He could no longer walk unaided. Great contraptions of pulley and winch were built to lift him from bed. Attendants strained under his immense weight, fearful of both the effort and his wrath. For even in this state, Henry's pride remained intact. He would not be pitied. He would not be seen as weak. And so the machinery of deception spun on. To the public, portraits were still commissioned, carefully staged, deliberately flattering. One such portrait, painted by Hans Holbein's lesser protege, depicted Henry standing proud in regal attire, a commanding stance defying the truth. In reality, the king could barely stand at all. When foreign envoys visited, elaborate arrangements were made. Henry would receive them seated upon his throne, richly dressed, hidden behind layers of perfume. They were told he was merely recovering from exertion, though they could smell the illness beneath the roses. It was an illusion everyone agreed to maintain, because the alternative, the truth of a dying king, was far more dangerous. In this fraught climate, courtiers circled like vultures. Each knew that Henry's death would create a vacuum, and within that emptiness, power could be claimed. But none knew when that moment would come. And until then, they would have to endure his rage. Catherine Howard, the king's fifth wife and cousin to the ill-fated Anne Boleyn, was one of the few who dared smile freely in his presence. She was young, only 19, and her beauty reignited something in Henry. Perhaps memory, perhaps illusion. She danced for him, sang for him, and he in turn doted upon her like a man half his age. He called her his rose without a thorn. But even roses conceal secrets. Catherine's dalliance with Henry Manox and Frances Dereham before her marriage was known to a few, whispered behind tapestries, traded like currency. But it wasn't until she grew too confident, too secure in the king's waning desire, that she risked rekindling old flames. Thomas Culpeper, a handsome and ambitious gentleman of the Privy Chamber, became the center of suspicion. Their meetings were secret, aided by trusted ladies-in-waiting. But secrets in the Tudor court were fragile things. One dropped letter, one careless word. That was all it took. In November 1541, Archbishop Cranmer delivered a letter to Henry, sealed, trembling slightly in his grip. The king was resting, reclined uncomfortably in a great cushioned chair, his leg elevated and swathed in bandages. His eyes were half-lidded from the pain drop, but he opened the letter and read. As he did, the room seemed to still. The words described betrayal, deceit, adultery. Catherine Howard, his child bride, had shamed him. For a moment he said nothing. His lips quivered, his face pale. Then, without warning, he erupted into such a fit of weeping that even Cranmer, hardened by years of service, was struck by the depth of it. He loved her, one servant would later say, more than he loved any before her, even the one who gave him a son. But Henry's love had limits. Catherine was arrested and confined within Hampton Court. She begged to see the king. Legend tells that she broke free from her guards and ran down the corridor screaming his name, barefoot and sobbing. But the guards caught her, and she never saw him again. On the 13th of February, 1542, she was beheaded on Tower Green. Henry did not attend. He remained alone in his chamber, fevered and listless, muttering prayers and names long dead. After her execution, the king changed. He withdrew from court for weeks. Music was forbidden, mirrors covered. The king, once a patron of art and splendor, sat in silence, staring into the fire. He spoke to no one of Catherine again, but her absence haunted him. Some claimed they heard him whisper to the darkness at night, calling her name. Others said he became obsessed with death, commissioning sermons about judgment, about sin, about the fires of damnation. It was as if he feared not only dying, but what would follow. By now, his courtiers had become his gaolers. They watched his every movement, charted his every breath. His meals were scrutinized, his medicines tested, his dreams recorded in the pages of private journals. He dreamed often of wolves. He told one physician that he was being hunted. "They are waiting," he said, "for me to sleep too long." No one knew who they were, but everyone understood. And still the leg worsened. At times, he suffered from fevers so high that his mind unraveled. He accused servants of plotting to murder him. He ordered locks changed. One night, he insisted that a demon had visited his chamber, sitting on his chest and whispering sins into his ear. The physician chalked it up to pain drops, but the royal confessor prescribed more prayers. This was not yet the end, but it was the deepening dusk. The king still signed laws, still demanded obedience, but each signature was shakier, each decree more tinged with desperation. In his moments of lucidity, he asked about his son, Prince Edward. Was he healthy? Was he learning his Latin? Was he growing strong? Those closest to Henry could not help but notice. He no longer asked to see Edward, only to hear of him. Perhaps he knew the child should not see what he had become. In the next part, we'll explore the eerie quiet of Henry's final marriage and the ghostly figure who became his nurse, queen, and shadow. For even kings, when brought low, must eventually turn to gentler hands. And in those hands, the story turns again. The winter of 1543 brought a coldness not just to the air, but to the king's bones. The chambers of Whitehall were draped in velvet and heavy wool, braziers burning ceaselessly to chase away the chill. Yet still, Henry VIII shivered. His body had grown uncooperative, lumbering and sallow, a once glorious vessel now betraying him one joint at a time. The court whispered of death often now, though not in those words. They spoke instead of transitions, of legacy, of the future of the young prince. But Henry was not dead, not yet, and to speak too freely of his end was to risk one's own. And so, amid this fearful hush, the court was startled when Henry announced he would take another wife. Her name was Catherine Parr. Catherine was not a young woman by Tudor standards. 31, twice widowed with no children to her name, she was quiet where others had been charming, measured where others had been eager. Her beauty was not the sort that lit ballads ablaze, but her mind, sharp, gentle, and profoundly pious, was her true allure. She had caught the king's eye not through dancing or flirtation, but through conversation. She spoke to him of scripture, of mercy, of order, and perhaps most importantly, she did not shrink from the sight of him. Henry was monstrous now, bloated, wheezing with open ulcers along his leg. He knew it, the court knew it, but Catherine Parr never recoiled. She offered prayers and salves, songs and silence. She soothed him like a balm upon raw skin. And so, on July 12, 1543, in the chapel at Hampton Court, they were married. This marriage was unlike the others. Catherine Parr did not arouse the reckless passions that Jane Seymour or Catherine Howard had. She did not scheme as Anne Boleyn had, nor did she sulk like Anne of Cleves. She was steady, patient, and in the slow erosion of Henry's final years, this was what he craved most. She became more than queen. She became caretaker. It was Catherine who organized the king's medicines, who arranged for clean bandages, who negotiated with the physicians when they bickered over treatments. When the king screamed in the night from pain, it was Catherine who came, who whispered verses from Psalms until he slipped back into a tortured sleep. To some at court, it seemed unnatural, undignified for a queen to nurse so personally, but she did not flinch. And in time, even Henry's infamous temper softened in her presence. She was also the first of his wives to truly embrace her role as stepmother. Catherine reached out to Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, daughters of Henry's previous marriages, both of whom had suffered from the shifting political winds of their father's affections. She invited them to dine. She encouraged their education. She even corresponded with scholars on their behalf. And young Prince Edward? She became a mother in all but blood. The children adored her, and Henry, watching this newfound harmony unfold in his crumbling household, was moved. "She has made my house whole again," he once reportedly said. But peace in the Tudor court was always fleeting. For Catherine was not only a queen and a nurse, she was also a thinker. And thinking, in Henry's England, was dangerous. She was deeply Protestant in her leanings, writing prayers and tracts that hinted at theological reform. She surrounded herself with scholars who questioned the old Catholic rites. And though she spoke softly, her ideas were sharp enough to draw blood if examined too closely. Soon, whispers began to circle the court. "She debates the king," they said. "She questions his faith." Some at court resented her influence. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a staunch conservative, was among them. He believed Catherine's reformist tendencies could sway the king too far, or worse, corrupt the young Edward, who was already surrounded by Protestant tutors. So quietly, he began to gather evidence, letters, conversations, witnesses, and eventually, he brought his suspicions before the king. For a brief, terrible time, Catherine Parr stood upon the edge of ruin. A warrant for her arrest was drawn. Plans were made to seize her during a morning stroll, and yet fate, or perhaps Catherine herself, intervened. She discovered the plot. That night, with trembling courage, she visited the king. He was in his chambers, groaning under the weight of his bandages, his legs stinking of old blood. She knelt beside him and wept, not from fear, but from devotion. She told him she had never meant to argue theology, only to distract him from his suffering, only to please his noble mind. Henry, touched by her submission, or perhaps comforted by her tears, tore up the warrant. When the guards came the next day, he waved them away with a sneer. "Fools," he said, "do you think I would harm my own darling nurse?" From that moment, Catherine Parr was untouchable. She became the silent center of Henry's world. As he grew weaker, more corpulent, and increasingly housebound, she took on more duties. She managed correspondences. She reviewed documents. At times, it was said, she even acted as regent in his absence. Yet through it all, she remained gentle, unassuming. Even when Henry's leg grew so foul that the stench could be smelled down the corridor, she did not leave him. Even when his mood swung to cruelty, when he shouted and threw goblets or refused to eat for days, she stood by. Because she knew, as many others did not, that Henry was not just a tyrant. He was a man dying slowly, painfully, and alone. And the king knew it too. He spoke more often of death now. He ordered the construction of his tomb, an elaborate affair that he planned in great detail. It was to be grand, befitting a king of divine right. Angels and cherubs, Latin inscriptions, space for Jane Seymour, who would lie beside him for eternity. Not Catherine, no. He would not have her buried with him. She was for this life only, this closing chapter, this slow descent. He would not let her follow him into death. In public, the king still clung to pomp. When he appeared, rare though it was, he wore magnificent robes, jewels sewn into the hems. But behind the garments was a ghost of a man. His arms were swollen, his face pocked and pale, his appetite erratic, driven more by memory than hunger. His mind, too, slipped at times. He repeated stories, forgot names, stared at shadows as though they spoke. But always, Catherine was there, guiding his hand, reading to him, holding his gaze when all others looked away. And in these quiet moments, it was said, the king was almost kind, almost human. In the next part, we will peer behind the chamber doors to witness the final months of Henry's reign, how those closest to him maneuvered, schemed, and prayed as the great Lion of England finally began to collapse beneath the weight of his own legend, and how even in his final breath, he tried to cling to power. In the final months of 1546, the corridors of Whitehall Palace echoed with an eerie calm. The courtiers moved like chess pieces, deliberate and cautious, their silks whispering against stone floors. Henry VIII, the once golden prince, now rarely emerged from his bedchamber. And when he did, it was in a wheeled chair, swaddled in fur, his face a pale canvas stretched across swollen bone. He was 55 years old. To most, he looked far older. The great leg ulcer had now bored so deep into the flesh that it was said one could see the bone. It stank with the sickly sweetness of decay, and no ointment could banish the scent. Surgeons no longer spoke of healing, only of managing. Each day, pus was drained into bowls. Each night, the wound was packed anew with linen soaked in wine, honey, and desperation. Henry bore it all with clenched teeth and occasional groans, but rarely with grace. His temper, already infamous, had become volcanic. Yet his mind, even in pain, remained calculating. The court around him knew what was coming. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. Death hovered over the palace like morning mist, invisible but ever present, and with it came the quiet frenzy of succession. Prince Edward, his long-awaited male heir, was still only 9 years old. Delicate and scholarly, the boy was intelligent but frail, his chest narrow, his skin pale. He had inherited neither his father's size nor his appetite for power. His future would depend not on strength, but on guardianship. And so the vultures gathered. There were factions forming, clearer now than ever before. On one side stood the conservatives, led by Thomas Wriothesley and Bishop Gardiner, who wished to preserve traditional Catholic rites despite the English break from Rome. On the other, the reformists, helmed by Edward Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, and John Dudley, men who sought to steer England toward a fully Protestant future. Each group whispered loyalties to the king. Each plotted behind closed doors. But they all shared one truth. The king would soon be gone, and with him, the delicate balance of power would shatter. Henry knew this. In his lucid moments, he worked feverishly to manage the future he could no longer see. He revised his will repeatedly, refining the Regency Council that would guide young Edward. He added names, then struck them out. He shuffled loyalties like cards, attempting to ensure that no single man would rise too high. But even as he signed and sealed these arrangements, he was already fading. Those closest to him began to notice strange changes. He slept for long stretches, his breath rattling like wind through reeds, his speech slurred, his skin took on a waxy sheen. Some days he did not recognize those around him, and on others, he recounted long-dead companions as if they were standing beside him. He spoke once of Anne Boleyn, not with bitterness but with something close to sorrow. She had fire, he murmured to Catherine Parr, his voice barely audible. I tried to tame it, but it burned. He never mentioned Catherine Howard again. Of Jane Seymour, he said nothing. He only asked that her portrait remain hanging near the bed. At night, Catherine would sit with him, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes dry from too many tears already shed in secret. She had ceased asking the physicians for hope. She had ceased begging God for a miracle. Instead, she read scripture softly as the king slept, hoping his last dreams might be filled with peace. Then came the final Christmas. It was a muted affair. No feasting, no music, no jesters leaping through the hall. A single mass was held. A few nobles were invited to the chamber. Henry watched them from his bed, dressed in white linen, his hands trembling as he raised them in greeting. He tried to speak, but the words faltered. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, and closed his eyes. It was the last time most of them would see him alive. In the days that followed, the king's decline accelerated. He could not eat, could not rise, could barely speak. He was moved to St. James's Palace, where his chamber was made as comfortable as possible. The thick tapestries were drawn to keep out drafts. The fire was stoked day and night. Candles burned in corners, their wax puddling on stone. The king lay still beneath fur and velvet, only his labored breath proving he had not yet slipped away. And even then, there was one thing he refused to do. He would not name the day. To speak of his death, to acknowledge it, was treason. Even as he withered before their eyes, his servants could not declare him dying. Even his physicians, their hands red from tending to him, dared not say the words aloud. The law was clear. If the king lived, he was the law. And if he died, chaos would rise before order could settle. So they waited in silence. Catherine Parr waited. The Regency Council waited. The boy Edward waited. And the kingdom itself held its breath. Then, one night in January 1547, the fire burned low in Henry's chamber. The king's breath had grown faint, so faint it was mistaken for silence. His eyes were closed, his skin pale, lips nearly blue. And yet no one moved. No one dared ask the question that weighed in every heart. It was Sir Anthony Denny, one of Henry's most trusted men, who finally stepped forward. He had seen enough. He summoned the archbishop, and still the courtiers around the king's bed watched uncertain. Was it over? Was it safe to say? Henry stirred once more. He opened his eyes, his lips parted. "Monks," he whispered. No one understood. It was his final word. He exhaled, long, slow, and then nothing. It was the 28th of January, 1547. The king was dead. But for hours afterward, no one said it aloud. To speak it too soon might be dangerous. To speak it too late might be treason. And so, in the great silence that followed, Henry VIII lay still, unmoving, unspoken of, while the world turned, waiting for someone to break the spell. In the next part, we will descend into the shadowed aftermath of the king's death, how his body was prepared, how the court responded behind closed doors, and how a journey to Windsor would begin with solemn prayers, but end in whispers of a most unnatural fate. For even in death, Henry would not rest easily. The death of Henry VIII was not announced immediately. For 2 days, his body lay still in the royal chamber at St. James's Palace, while silence ruled the court. Outside the windows, the January air pressed cold and still against the panes, and inside the fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows over the swollen figure beneath the covers. No trumpets blared, no black banners were unfurled. The great King of England had passed into eternity, yet the world continued quietly, carefully. Because power, in that suspended moment, was not yet secure, the court moved cautiously. Only a few were informed, those closest to the matter of succession. The Privy Council convened in secret. Messengers were dispatched under the cover of darkness. The young Prince Edward, now King Edward VI, was fetched from Hertfordshire and brought to London under heavy guard. He was told of his father's death in a small candlelit chamber by men whose faces were drawn and graved. He said nothing. Instead, the boy bowed his head and whispered a prayer. He was only 9. When the official proclamation came on January 31st, it struck England like a sudden wind through brittle trees. The king is dead. Long live the king. And with that, the mask of certainty was restored. But behind the black draped doors of St. James's, the rituals of death were still underway. Henry's body had already begun to change. The physicians and embalmers moved with ritual and reluctance. The king's frame was vast, his body distended with fluids and rot. The leg ulcers, long untreated in his final days, had begun to seep through the linen wrappings. A sharp metallic scent filled the chamber. First came the washing. The body was stripped, cleansed with rosewater and vinegar. But the effort was largely symbolic. The decay was too far advanced. Next, the entrails were removed, though with great difficulty. The inner organs had bloated and blackened, and even the most seasoned embalmers turned away as they worked. The cavity was packed with herbs, lavender, myrrh, cinnamon bark, camphor, and then stitched closed. The outer flesh was oiled, wrapped in waxed linen, and finally enclosed in lead-lined coffins. Not one, but several layers, for caution. But it was already too late. The rot had taken hold. Though sealed and perfumed, the body continued to bloat. Gases swelled within the corpse, pushing at the wrappings, threatening rupture. And worse, rumors began to circulate among the servants that the body made noise in the night. A faint groaning, a wheeze. One terrified chambermaid swore she heard it whisper. "It is merely pressure," the embalmers assured. "It is the nature of the dead." But unease spread like frost on glass. By February, Henry's funeral procession was prepared. It would be grand, as befitting a king who had ruled with fire and steel. The journey would take several days, moving slowly from London to Windsor, where Henry would be interred beside Jane Seymour, the wife he loved, the wife who gave him a son. The coffin was placed upon a carriage drawn by 8 black horses, draped in velvet and golden lace. Priests walked before it, chanting litanies. Nobles followed in silence, clad in mourning black, faces solemn beneath wide-brimmed hats. People lined the roads as the procession passed, but many did not weep. They watched, and they whispered. For something strange occurred along the journey. The weather, though winter, turned strangely mild. The ice along the roads thawed. The air hung damp and warm, and the coffin began to leak. Some say it was only melted wax. Others were less certain. At night, when the procession stopped to rest at Sion Abbey, the coffin was stored in a chapel cloister. Guards stood watch. And still, by morning, a strange puddle had formed beneath the bier. A dark, syrupy fluid. They cleaned it quickly, quietly, but the smell lingered. And then there was the dog. A black stray, thin and ragged, appeared at the Abbey grounds that morning. No one knew from where it came. It slipped through the guards, climbed to the platform, and licked the leaking fluid from beneath the coffin. Some screamed, others crossed themselves. The animal was driven off, beaten with torches, but to those watching, it was a sign. They recalled a prophecy, spoken by a foreign friar years before, that the king who defied the Pope would die the death of Ahab, and that dogs would lap his blood. It was superstition, perhaps, but in the Tudor court, superstition held power. When the procession finally reached Windsor, the mood was grim. The scent of death traveled with them, despite the herbs and cloth. The coffin was sealed again, an iron screen erected to veil it from sight. The funeral was conducted at St. George's Chapel. The choir sang solemnly, scripture was read. No eulogy was offered, and when the time came, the coffin was lowered into the vault beside Jane Seymour. No monument had been completed. Henry's ambitious tomb, once planned with gold angels and sculpted saints, was still unfinished. Funds had been diverted, craftsmen dismissed. So he was buried in a simple chamber beneath a flagstone that read only, King Henry VIII and Queen Jane Seymour. And thus England's most fearsome monarch passed into the earth. But even in burial, peace eluded him. Over time, the vault flooded and cracked. Other coffins were placed atop his. One day, centuries later, the slab would be lifted, and those who peered inside would see bones and dust, mingled and disturbed, the king's remains jumbled with others. The man who had ruled like a god, broken from Rome, and torn England into a new age, had returned to the same silence as all men. There was no fire, no judgment, no divine chariot, only darkness, and perhaps the faint echo of a dog's howl far in the distance. In the next part, we will explore what was left behind, how Henry's death unraveled the careful plans of his final years, how the Regency Council fractured under the weight of ambition, and how a sickly child king was left to carry the crown of a crumbling kingdom. For the end of one king was only the beginning of a far more delicate chapter. The stone had barely settled over Henry VIII's tomb when the whispering began. In the echoing halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court, in the privy chambers and candlelit corridors, names were spoken in caution and ambition. For while the Lion of England had finally closed his eyes, the question remained, who would hold the leash to the crown now? Young Edward VI was king in name, but he was just a boy, frail in body, mild in manner, and steeped in Latin more than politics. And around him circled a court of seasoned predators, each cloaked in robes of loyalty, but with daggers drawn beneath. Henry, in his final attempt to control the chaos, had left behind a will, long, legal, and filled with the paranoia of a dying king. Within it, he established a regency council composed of 16 noblemen and advisors, each with equal authority. No single regent, no single hand on the helm. It was, as ever, Henry's way, command from beyond the grave, but the dead do not rule long. In the weeks after the funeral, the council gathered in shadowed rooms to read and interpret the will. At the table sat men of high name and quiet danger. Edward Seymour, the boy king's uncle, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, Thomas Riothes, the Lord Chancellor, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and others, each calculating, each watching. Henry had hoped they would work together. That balance would preserve his son's throne. But balance is unnatural in politics. The first move came swiftly. Edward Seymour, shrewd and cool in demeanor, was declared Lord Protector of the realm. It was framed not as ambition, but necessity. The boy king needed guidance, a firm hand, a blood relative. And so the council, perhaps tired, perhaps afraid, acquiesced. In one motion, the will was weakened, and in another, power tilted. Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, wasted no time. He surrounded young Edward with Protestant tutors. He restructured the household. He positioned allies in key offices. And though the boy wore the crown, it was Somerset's words that guided royal policy. The new regime was progressive, reformist, bold. Church images were destroyed. Catholic masses were abolished. Latin was replaced with English in services. The Book of Common Prayer began its slow rise, and monasteries, what few had remained after Henry's purge, were finally swept away. The people, weary and confused, watched this second Reformation unfold with a mix of fear and awe. But not all approved, and not all were silent. Among the first to chafe was Thomas Seymour, Edward's other uncle and brother to the Lord Protector. He was bold where Edward Seymour was cautious, handsome, daring, and wildly ambitious, and he resented his brother's swift consolidation of power. While Somerset ruled, Thomas was handed lesser titles and minor influence. It was not enough. And so he turned his charm to a different strategy. Catherine Parr. The Dowager Queen had returned to her estate following Henry's death, her mourning marked more by relief than grief. In her quiet rooms, she began to write again, hymns, reflections, essays on the soul. But her peace was not to last. Thomas Seymour arrived, grieving and attentive, whispering of love lost and futures shared. The court raised eyebrows, but before long he and Catherine were secretly married. The union was dangerous, unapproved by the council, hidden from young Edward, and when it came to light it caused ripples across the court. Somerset was enraged, though outwardly diplomatic. Catherine was, after all, the king's widow. And Thomas had broken protocol, grasping at influence through his new royal connection. Still, the marriage held, and for a brief time, it brought joy. But beneath it, seeds of destruction had been sown. Thomas Seymour's ambition grew insatiable. He wanted more than proximity. He wanted access to the king. He visited Edward without permission. He offered him coins. He whispered doubts about his older brother. He tried to charm the young king with promises of a more glorious personal rule. But Edward, though young, was not naive. He told his tutors, his protectors, and the council took notice. Meanwhile, Catherine Parr, now pregnant for the first time in her life, began to grow ill. The child was born a daughter, but within days, Catherine was struck with childbed fever. She died in September 1548, her last hours filled with pain and incoherent mutterings. Her death shattered what little anchor Thomas had left, and from that moment, his decline was inevitable. In early 1549, Thomas Seymour was arrested. The charges were numerous: attempting to kidnap the king, breaking into the king's chambers, hoarding arms. But beneath the formal accusations lay a single truth. He had flown too close to power, and the sun had burned him. He was tried, found guilty, and sentenced. Edward, still a child, was made to sign the warrant for his uncle's execution. On March 20th, 1549, Thomas Seymour was beheaded at the Tower of London. No final speech, no crowd, only silence. The boy king did not cry. With Thomas gone and Catherine buried, Edward Seymour stood alone at the summit of power. But his fall, too, was already in motion. The country was restless. The people starved. Religious reform bred rebellion. The prayer book rebellion in the west, Kett's rebellion in the east. Somerset wavered, uncertain how to quell the unrest. He began to isolate, to lash out, to trust only a few. and his enemies gathered strength. Chief among them, John Dudley. In the next part, we'll follow the cunning rise of John Dudley, how he navigated the treacherous world left in Henry's wake, and how he laid the foundation for one of England's most tragic queens. For while Henry's body lay in silence beneath Windsor, his legacy lived on, not in glory, but in ambition, betrayal, and blood. The fall of Edward Seymour came not with a shout, but with a slow unraveling. By 1550, his grip on power was brittle, held together by fear, fractured by mistrust. His reforms had been sweeping but unpopular, his leadership bold but increasingly erratic. Across England, the fields were emptying, harvests had failed, enclosures fenced out the poor, peasant revolts simmered like low fires, and in the corridors of court the whispers grew louder. John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, moved silently through this growing unease like a shadow across stone. Where Seymour had ruled through family ties and bold declarations, Dudley played a longer game. He listened, he watched, he waited, and then he struck. He gathered allies within the council, men tired of Somerset's arrogance, weary of chaos, hungry for a firmer hand. Some were true believers, others were merely opportunists. But Dudley knew that unity need not be born of loyalty, only of shared interest. In October 1549, they acted. Edward Seymour was arrested and removed from his position as Lord Protector. The charges were vague: overreach of power, mishandling of rebellion, alienation of nobility. No one wept, no one protested. The boy king, now 12, was informed gently, and when asked how he felt about his uncle's fall, young Edward simply said, "He ruled badly." Somerset was spared at first. He was imprisoned in the Tower, but later released and welcomed cautiously back into court. Dudley, newly styled Duke of Northumberland, understood the value of appearance. He did not rush to destroy his enemies. Not yet. Instead, he tightened his grip on the boy king. Edward was placed firmly within his household, surrounded by tutors and servants loyal to Northumberland. His letters were monitored, his proclamations drafted for him. Yet all the while, Dudley treated him with warmth and flattery. He called Edward our noble philosopher king. He fed his ego with whispers of destiny, and Edward, eager to be more than a child with a crown, listened closely. Under Northumberland's guidance, the English Reformation surged forward. The new Book of Common Prayer was made law. Altars were stripped, saints' days erased, vestments burned. The world that Henry VIII had left, half Catholic, half Protestant, suspended in compromise, was now swept aside. A new England was rising. But beneath the surface, danger bloomed. The people were weary, the nobility fractured, and the young king's health, once merely delicate, began to decline. It began quietly, a cough that lingered, a shadow beneath the eyes, then fevers, night sweats, bone-deep fatigue. By early 1553, Edward's physicians grew concerned. The boy was not growing, his strength was failing, the color drained from his lips. He began to lose interest in his studies. His appetite waned, his breath came shallow and quick. The diagnosis was never clear. Some said tuberculosis, others consumption of the lungs, but all agreed. Edward VI, the last son of Henry VIII, was dying, and with his illness came panic, because Edward had no children, no brothers. His half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were the next in line by Henry's will and by law, but both posed threats to the Protestant regime Northumberland had built. Mary was a devout Catholic. If she took the throne, the Reformation would unravel overnight, the Latin Mass would return, and Northumberland's power would vanish. Elizabeth, though Protestant, was a wild card, independent, ambitious, too dangerous, too uncertain. And so Northumberland did what he believed he must. He made a plan. He turned to Lady Jane Grey. Jane was the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister. She was 16, pale, bookish, and fiercely intelligent, raised in the humanist tradition, Protestant to the bone, and crucially married to Northumberland's son, Guilford Dudley. By Edward's reckoning, she was legitimate enough. He was convinced, or perhaps persuaded. In the spring of 1553, Edward drafted a new device for succession. It named Lady Jane Grey as his heir, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth. The document was signed by judges and nobles, some willingly, others under pressure. But it was done. The crown would pass to Jane, a teenage girl, a queen in name only. Edward died on July 6, 1553. He was 15. No grand funeral, no state mourning. His body, small and cold, was buried in Westminster Abbey under Protestant rites. Northumberland kept his death secret for several days, hoping to secure Jane's position before the news spread. On July 10th, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England. She did not celebrate. When the crown was placed upon her head at the Tower, she wept. "I am not fit for it," she whispered. But it was too late. The machinery had begun to turn. Yet Mary Tudor had already heard the news. She had fled to East Anglia, gathering supporters, riding with speed and fury, her banners bearing the image of the Virgin Mary. Loyalists flocked to her cause. Nobles hesitated. Soldiers defected. The people, weary of change, yearned for the comfort of the old faith. Within 9 days, Mary reached London. The tide had turned. Northumberland's men melted away. And on July 19th, Mary Tudor was proclaimed queen. Lady Jane Grey, Queen of England for 9 short days, was arrested and confined to the Tower. Her crown removed, her fate sealed. In the next part, we'll walk with Lady Jane Grey through the dark stone corridors of the Tower and into the quiet chambers where she awaited judgment. For though she never sought power, power had chosen her, and it would now ask a terrible price. The story of Jane is not one of ambition, but of innocence caught in the machinery of kings. The Tower of London loomed gray against the late summer sky, its ancient walls soaked in the whispers of centuries, its corridors tight with secrets. It had served many roles: fortress, palace, prison. But in the summer of 1553, it became a silent tomb for a girl who had once been called queen. Lady Jane Grey was escorted through Traitor's Gate on a boat that glided silently along the Thames. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the fingers trembling though her face remained composed. She wore no jewels, no velvet gown, just a simple dress of ash-gray wool. There was no crowd, no jeers, no shouts of outrage or sympathy, only the sound of water against stone and the muffled voices of guards who knew that they were escorting not a traitor, but a girl swept into the eye of a storm. She was 16. Her quarters were modest, hidden within the walls of the gentleman gaoler's lodging, safe from public view, but close enough to the scaffold that she could see the execution platform from her narrow window. She was given books, a Bible, paper, and ink. A single lamp flickered at night, and every morning she awoke to the sounds of ravens and bells. Those who spoke with her noted her calmness. She quoted scripture with quiet grace. She asked after her parents. She refused to speak of her husband, Guildford Dudley, who had also been imprisoned, held elsewhere in the Tower under heavier guard. She knew what they had done. They had used her, and now they had abandoned her. Mary Tudor, newly crowned, faced a delicate balance. The people rejoiced at her arrival, singing hymns in the streets, lighting candles in windows. The old ways were returning, crosses restored, Latin prayers chanted once more. The Mass was heard in St. Paul's Cathedral for the first time in years. But Mary's throne was not yet steady. There were still Protestants in power, still Dudley loyalists lurking, and still the young Lady Jane, alive, imprisoned, and a symbol, however unwilling, of resistance. At first, Mary chose mercy. She declared that Jane had been forced into the crown by her ambitious family, that she was innocent, a pawn in a greater game. Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, was briefly imprisoned, then released. Even Jane's mother, Frances, was allowed to visit her daughter in the Tower. The people murmured approval, but peace in Mary's reign would prove to be fleeting. In early 1554, unrest returned to the streets. A man named Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion. His cause was simple. He opposed Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain. The English feared that union would bind their kingdom to Spanish power and Catholic tyranny. Thousands gathered behind him. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, but not before it reached the edges of London, and Mary's trust began to wither, because among the names whispered by Wyatt's followers, one rose again and again: Jane. Mary's council urged swift action. If Jane remained alive, she would always be a threat, a symbol of Protestant hope, a banner waiting to be raised, and worse, her very innocence made her dangerous. She had not sought the crown. She had not fought to keep it. And yet, many saw her as the rightful heir. Mary, torn between justice and mercy, delayed as long as she could. But the pressure mounted, and finally, a warrant was signed. On the 10th of February, 1554, Guildford Dudley was informed he would die in 3 days. He begged to see Jane one last time. She refused. It would only increase our pain, she said quietly, and draw our minds from God. They would meet again, she told him, in heaven. On the morning of February 12th, Guilford was led to the scaffold. Jane, from her window, saw the procession. She turned away as the axe fell. Later that same morning, 2 guards came for her. She walked without protest, accompanied by a small group of witnesses, a chaplain and her gentlewoman. She wore a black gown, her hair down, her hands clasped around a small book of prayers. As she stepped onto the scaffold, she glanced up at the sky. "I pray you all," she said, her voice soft but clear, "bear me witness that I die a true Christian woman, and that I do look to be saved by no other means but by the mercy of God in the blood of his only Son, Jesus Christ." She knelt. The executioner, masked and silent, stepped forward. Jane reached out, blindfolded, and struggled to find the block. "Where is it?" she whispered. A hand guided her. And then silence. One stroke, one sigh, and she was gone. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, near Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and so many others claimed by Tudor politics. No monument was raised, only a slab of stone, worn smooth by time. The girl who ruled for 9 days left behind no heir, no memoirs, no power, only sorrow. Mary Tudor wept in private, it was said. She had not wanted to kill Jane, but the throne demanded sacrifices, and this would not be the last. We'll descend into the shadowed years of Mary's reign, how her fervor for faith turned to flame, how England became a land of fire and martyrdom, and how the queen once called merciful became remembered by another name entirely, Bloody Mary. For the road to salvation, in her eyes, would be paved in ash. The first year of Mary Tudor's reign was filled with cautious hope. Bells rang, choirs sang, and the people flooded the streets with prayer books once again bound in Latin. The crosses were lifted from cellar to altar, and the scent of incense returned to sacred spaces long emptied by her father's Reformation. To many, it felt as though England was being restored to grace. But beneath this return of ritual, a storm brewed, quiet at first, like the soft tolling of a funeral bell before the procession. Mary was no ordinary monarch. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, niece to the Emperor Charles V, and a woman who had survived disgrace, exile, and threat of execution under her father's tyranny. She had knelt in the cold of castles and waited for death more than once. But now, crowned and enthroned, she saw herself not only as queen, but as God's instrument. She would save England's soul, even if it burned in the process. The first signs came as law. In 1554, Parliament repealed many of Henry VIII's religious acts. The heresy laws were reinstated. The church was returned to papal obedience. Monasteries were not rebuilt, but the altar cloths and icons returned. England, once a battleground of compromise, was now swinging swiftly in one direction. Mary believed the country had been poisoned, its people led astray by false prophets, by Lutherans and Calvinists, by heretics cloaked in piety. She would cleanse it, and she began with the highest flames. The first to die was John Rogers, a clergyman and translator, burned at the stake in February 1555 outside Newgate. He had once helped produce the English Bible. Now he stood chained, wrapped in pitch-soaked rags as the crowd looked on, some silent, some weeping, some praying aloud. Rogers refused to recant. He was set alight, and the fire took him quickly, and then another, and another. Soon the fire spread like plague. Bishop Hugh Latimer, an old man with a voice that once echoed across university halls, was condemned. Nicholas Ridley, another bishop, joined him. On October 16th, they were brought to Broad Street in Oxford, bound side by side. As the executioner readied the firewood, Latimer turned to Ridley with eyes steady and voice clear. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." And the flame was lit, the fire rose, and the people looked on in horror. The queen remained secluded in her palace. She did not attend the executions, but she knew of each one. She signed the warrants. She read the confessions. She prayed over the ashes. To her, these were not deaths. They were redemptions. But among the people, something shifted. The fires were not cleansing anymore. They were terrifying. More than 280 people were burned during Mary's reign, men, women, even the elderly. Some were scholars, others simple folk who had read an English Bible or refused to attend Mass. In small towns and villages, Pyres were built in public squares. Children were made to watch. England, once uncertain in its faith, now trembled in it. In the midst of this spiritual purge, Mary sought to secure her legacy through marriage. She turned to Philip of Spain, her cousin, her equal in faith, her partner in salvation. But the match was deeply unpopular. Philip was Spanish, foreign, and seen as cold. The people feared that England would become a vassal of the Habsburg Empire, that its gold, its ships, its very crown would pass into foreign hands. Still, the wedding took place in Winchester Cathedral in July 1554. Mary wore cloth of gold, her face bright with hope, her heart filled with longing. She was 38, and she believed she would bear a son. But time passed, and no child came. In 1555, Mary began to show signs of pregnancy. Her belly swelled, her appetite changed. She withdrew from court, waiting for the birth in seclusion. But months passed, and no child came. It was a phantom pregnancy, perhaps brought on by desperation, perhaps by illness. And when it faded, so too did Mary's hope. Philip left soon after, returning to Spain, leaving his wife in sorrow and solitude. And still, the fires burned. Even her most loyal subjects began to falter. Whispers of discontent trickled through court. The Queen's own advisors grew cautious. Foreign ambassadors wrote back to their courts with concern. Mary was no longer merely pious. She was consumed. In her chambers, she prayed longer, slept less, spoke less. Her face aged quickly. Her skin grew pale. She walked with a stiffness born of fatigue. Her people, once joyous at her accession, now avoided her name. She was no longer Queen Mary, the rightful heir. She was becoming something else, Bloody Mary. The nickname began in secret, spoken in hushed tones in taverns and among servants. It spread in pamphlets and letters smuggled across the channel. And with each fire, each pile of ash left in town squares, the name gained power. Bloody Mary, a queen of faith, a queen of fear. By 1558, her health failed completely. Her second phantom pregnancy left her frail. Her eyes dimmed, her hair thinned. She lost her appetite. Philip in Spain sent polite letters but never returned. She died on the 17th of November, aged 42. Her body racked with pain, her legacy in ruins. She left no child, no heir of her faith, only ashes and silence. In the next part, we shall follow the rise of her half-sister, Elizabeth, how a girl once imprisoned in the Tower stepped into the crown's weight with careful breath, and how she would inherit not only a throne, but a kingdom desperate to forget the flames. For where Mary ruled through fire, Elizabeth would learn to rule through shadows. The bells tolled low and solemn on the morning of November 17, 1558. The skies above London were gray with the softness of winter's breath, and the city moved slowly in the gloom, wrapped in quiet. Mary Tudor, Queen of England, was dead. Her body lay still in the palace of St. James, her hands clasped over her chest, her lips colorless, her legacy still smoking in the memories of her people. But as one chapter closed, another stirred from the shadows. At Hatfield House, 30 miles from London, a young woman waited. She stood by a frost-glazed window, her breath misting the glass, her thoughts unreadable. She had lived half her life beneath suspicion, her mother beheaded, her name erased, her life weighed with the delicate thread of politics and fear. Elizabeth Tudor had been many things: princess, bastard, prisoner, threat. Now she was queen. The messenger arrived before dawn. He knelt, breathless, cloaked in the cold of the journey, and presented the queen's ring, removed from Mary's lifeless finger. Elizabeth received it in silence. Then, after a long pause, she knelt in the frozen grass beneath an ancient oak and whispered the words of Scripture. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." She entered London in December to the sound of drums and trumpets, her red gold hair loose about her shoulders, her gown shimmering with pearls. Crowds lined the streets. Some waved handkerchiefs, some crossed themselves, and many simply watched, quietly, as this woman who had once been caged now rode triumphant through the heart of a nation unsure of its soul. The coronation followed swiftly. Westminster Abbey, still tinged with Catholic smoke, echoed with a new voice. Elizabeth was crowned on January 15, 1559. The archbishop who had once refused to crown her was gone. In his place stood Owen Oglethorpe, a man who spoke Latin but trembled as he placed the crown upon her head. She was 25, and England waited to see what kind of queen she would become. The court transformed. The scent of incense faded. Crucifixes were removed from walls. Latin chants gave way to English prayer. But there were no mass arrests, no fires. Elizabeth knew the land was weary. It had seen too much blood, too many reversals, too many banners burned and raised again. So she did not command faith with fires. She offered compromise. The Elizabethan settlement was her answer to the chaos of the past. The Act of Supremacy declared her head of the Church of England, but not with the grandiosity of her father. She was not supreme head, but supreme governor, a gentler title, designed to soothe. The Act of Uniformity restored the Book of Common Prayer, but with careful revisions crafted so that both Protestant and moderate Catholic could find a familiar phrase. It was a careful dance, a balancing act. A crown of thorns she wore with grace, and she danced well. Still, dangers remained. In Rome, the Pope called her a heretic. In Spain, Philip watched with interest and disappointment. He had once been her brother-in-law. Now he was her potential enemy. France whispered too, offering support to Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic with Tudor blood and a claim to the English throne. Elizabeth knew she walked upon a dagger's edge, so she watched. She waited. And she built a court not of soldiers, but of poets, scholars, and spies. She appointed William Cecil, wise and measured, as her chief advisor. Together, they governed with caution and vision. Francis Walsingham, her spy master, built a web of informants across Europe. Ambassadors were watched, letters intercepted, threats silenced before they had time to breathe. And at the heart of it all, the Queen stood serene, but she trusted few and loved fewer. They called her the Virgin Queen, though the title was as much strategy as chastity. She entertained suitors, kings, dukes, princes, but married none. Each proposal was considered, weighed, and politely declined. Some believe she remained unmarried for love of Robert Dudley, her childhood companion and favorite courtier. Their bond was undeniable, their time alone, frequent. But Elizabeth knew too well what marriage had done to her mother, to her sister, to queens across Europe. Marriage was risk. Independence was survival. She would not trade one crown for another. Meanwhile, her people watched with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. They had expected another Mary. Instead, they received a queen who quoted Latin, danced in the gardens, laughed with courtiers, and delivered speeches with a fire that made even hardened soldiers weep. She toured the countryside, showing her face to the common folk, hearing their petitions, offering prayers. She became legend while still alive. Gloriana, the fairy queen. But behind the mask of splendor, Elizabeth remained haunted. The tower still stood in her memory. She had been there once, a prisoner under her sister's reign. The walls had seemed alive then, pressing in around her, whispering of death. She remembered the chill of the stones, the drip of water, the clink of chains, and she remembered the door, the one that had opened not to execution, but to freedom. Now, years later, she passed the tower often. She never entered, but she always looked. In her private chambers, she kept a portrait of her mother, Anne Boleyn, long vilified, long erased. No court painter had dared to display it openly during Henry's reign, but Elizabeth kept it close. She studied the dark eyes, the proud mouth. She wondered how much of that woman lived in her, and how much she could afford to let show. England began to change under her touch. Trade flourished, the navy grew, new lands were sought. The names of men like Drake, Raleigh, and Hawkins began to echo across the seas. The Renaissance bloomed in full, and at the heart of it was a queen who ruled alone, yet never seemed lonely. But always, in the north, in the background, another queen waited. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, Elizabeth's shadow, and one day, her greatest trial. In the next part, we will turn our gaze to the court of Scotland, where Mary Stuart, queen, widow, and rival, would begin her own descent. A queen of beauty and tragedy whose path would cross Elizabeth's in a dance of crowns, secrets, and sorrow. For in the world of queens, there is little room for mercy. Far to the north, beyond the soft mists of the English countryside and past the wild borderlands, Scotland lay under a sky of low clouds and whispered storms. In its castles and cathedrals, they spoke not of Elizabeth, but of another queen, one whose beauty inspired ballads and whose name carried both grace and foreboding. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. From the moment of her birth in December 1542, Mary was marked by fate. Her father, King James V of Scotland, died just 6 days later, leaving the infant Mary the last surviving legitimate heir to the Stuart line. As snow fell gently over Linlithgow Palace, a cradle was crowned, a queen at 6 days old. Scotland in those years was a land torn in spirit, its nobles feuded like kings. Its churches were beginning to feel the first tremors of Reformation, and its neighbor England watched with hungry eyes. The English crown sought to control Mary's future, to arrange a marriage that would tie the two kingdoms together under Tudor power. But Scotland was proud, and France was nearer in spirit. So at the tender age of 5, Mary was sent across the sea. She arrived in France like a jewel wrapped in silk. Tall for her age, with luminous eyes, auburn hair, and a voice that turned heads even in childhood, Mary captivated the French court. She was raised alongside the Dauphin, Francis, to whom she was betrothed. Her accent softened. Her gowns became Parisian. She spoke Latin, Greek, Italian, and of course flawless French. The girl queen became a lady of courts. And in 1558, just months before Elizabeth took the English throne, Mary wed Francis and became Queen of France. Briefly. For Francis II was a delicate boy, plagued by weakness and sickness. He reigned for less than 2 years before death took him, leaving Mary, at 18, a widow in black, her crown cracked and her place in France uncertain. The court turned cold. Catherine de' Medici, the queen mother, no longer needed her. And so, with sorrow in her chest and the sea before her, Mary returned to Scotland in 1561. She returned not as the child queen they had remembered, but as a Catholic woman raised in the splendor of France, refined, educated, and fiercely aware of her divine right. But Scotland had changed. The land she returned to was harsh and fractured. The nobility no longer bowed easily. John Knox, the firebrand preacher of the Reformation, roared sermons from pulpits, calling her Jezebel, idolatress, and whore of Babylon. The monasteries had crumbled. The Mass was outlawed in most regions, and the people, suspicious of French ways and papal ties, watched her with narrowed eyes. Still, Mary rode out. She wore black silk, her veil long, her voice gentle. She smiled when insulted. She prayed in private, and she ruled with more patience than her enemies expected, but not more than they feared. She summoned her council. She made speeches in Parliament. She pardoned rebels and wrote letters in her own hand. And for a time, it seemed she might succeed, might bend Scotland's roughness to her will, might unite crown and country. But she was young, and she was alone. She needed an heir. She needed a husband. There were many suitors, foreign princes, noblemen, and hopeful favorites. But Mary, perhaps impetuously, perhaps rebelliously, chose Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was tall, elegant, and shared her royal blood, descended like Mary herself from Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII. Their union strengthened her claim to the English throne, but it weakened her hold on Scotland. Darnley, once charming, revealed himself to be vain, reckless, and deeply insecure. He resented Mary's power. He drank, gambled, and consorted with unsavory company. Within a year of their marriage, the court was scandalized by his behavior. And then came the most chilling act of all. In March 1566, Darnley and a group of conspirators burst into Mary's private chambers at Holyrood Palace. There, before her eyes, they seized her secretary, David Rizzio, a foreign-born Catholic whom they suspected of undue influence. He was stabbed more than 50 times, his blood soaking the stone floor at Mary's feet. She was 6 months pregnant. She watched, silent, stunned, and something inside her changed. She gave birth to a son, James, in June 1566. The child, healthy and strong, was her triumph, but Darnley had become unbearable, and within the halls of the palace, a new plan was forming. In February 1567, Darnley was found dead. The house where he had been staying, Kirk-o-Field, was blown apart by gunpowder, but his body, unburned, was discovered in the garden, showing signs of strangulation. No one believed it was accident, and many believed Mary knew. Soon after, she shocked the world again. She married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man most suspected of Darnley's murder. It was a scandal that shattered her image. Whether it was love, coercion, or desperation, no one could say. But the damage was done. The nobility rose against her. Armies met, and Mary surrendered. She was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, a gray fortress surrounded by water, cold and silent. There, under pressure, she signed an abdication. Her infant son, James, was crowned King of Scots. She was no longer queen. She was a prisoner, but not forever. In May 1568, she escaped. Disguised and desperate, she fled across the border into England, seeking refuge from her cousin, Elizabeth Tudor, a fellow queen, a fellow woman in a world of men. But Elizabeth did not welcome her with open arms. She saw in Mary not a sister, but a rival, a threat, and thus began a captivity that would stretch for 19 long years. In the next part, we will step into the strange, quiet war that followed. A chess match between two queens, one imprisoned, one ruling. Letters passed in code, plots whispered in candlelight, and a question that would haunt Elizabeth to her final breath. What to do with Mary, Queen of Scots? The castle Elizabeth chose for Mary was no dungeon, but neither was it freedom. Tutbury, Sheffield, Wingfield, Fotheringhay. Over the years, the names of these castles would fade into one another like chapters in a book written in whispers. Each was grand in its own right, with high towers, warm tapestries, and gentle hills stretching beyond the gates. But for Mary, Queen of Scots, they were gilded cages. She was given servants, a small court, books, embroidery, and prayer. But she was watched, always watched. Guards in the halls, spies in the kitchens. Every letter she wrote was opened, every visitor approved. She was a queen without a crown, a guest without freedom. And still she waited. Elizabeth had not decided her fate. To imprison a queen, after all, was to set a precedent. Mary was not just a former monarch. She was Kun, granddaughter of Henry VII, a Tudor by blood. And to many Catholics, she was the rightful Queen of England. Elizabeth had no husband, no heir, and her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been branded a harlot by those loyal to Rome. That left Mary, a Catholic queen with a child, a powerful network in Europe, and a claim to the English throne as a figurehead for discontent. She was too dangerous to set free, but too royal to simply kill. And so the standoff began. In the cold, candlelit rooms of her captivity, Mary wrote letters, endless letters. She wrote to her son James in Scotland, begging for loyalty, for warmth. He grew older, more Protestant, more distant. She wrote to the kings of Europe, pleading for protection, for intervention. And quietly, she wrote to Catholics in England, those who longed for the old ways, the Latin Mass, the Pope's blessing. These were the letters that would shape her fate. Some were innocent, some were not. Elizabeth, in her own palaces, weighed Mary's presence like a knife in the folds of her robe. She told her council she did not want blood. She wanted peace. But her spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, saw the shadows for what they were. He believed Mary was plotting. And in time, she was. The first real threat came in 1570, when Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth, declaring her a heretic and illegitimate queen. The bull of excommunication unleashed a firestorm. It gave English Catholics a moral license to disobey her. Some took it as a call to rise up. Rebellions followed, the Northern Earls, the Rodolphi plot. Each whispered Mary's name, each failed. But Walsingham grew more determined. He built a network of spies that stretched from London to Rome. He intercepted letters, he broke ciphers, he planted informants in Mary's household. The net was tightening, and still Mary wrote. She grew ill with time. Her hair turned gray. Her limbs ached. The dampness of the stone walls seeped into her bones. She missed France. She missed freedom. She longed for the sweet perfume of spring in the Loire Valley, for the soft murmur of chapel choirs at Vespers. She sang old songs to herself in the mornings. She embroidered scenes from scripture. She read psalms aloud, even when no one listened. But she never stopped believing that she would rule again. And then came the Babington plot. In 1586, a young Catholic nobleman, Anthony Babington, wrote to Mary in secret. His letter, smuggled in a hollowed-out beer barrel, proposed a bold plan: rescue Mary, assassinate Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism to England. Mary responded. Her letter, written in code, hidden in the same channel, gave cautious approval. But Walsingham had already seen it. His agents had intercepted the correspondence. The cipher had been broken. The Queen of Shadows had been caught in the light. Mary was arrested formally, this time as more than a guest. She was brought to trial. It was no ordinary trial. A queen being judged by her cousin's counselors, accused of treason against a crown she never wore. She defended herself with poise. She declared her innocence. She invoked her royal blood. She asked to speak directly to Elizabeth. The request was denied. In October 1586, she was found guilty, and Elizabeth was left to decide. The burden crushed her. Elizabeth wept, raged, paced in her chambers. She knew what execution meant. Not just the death of a woman, but the death of a queen, a precedent, a sin. She signed the warrant and then tried to unsign it, but it was too late. Her council acted swiftly, fearing hesitation. The axe was prepared. On the morning of February 8, 1587, Mary was led to the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. She wore a gown of black velvet, beneath it crimson, Catholic martyrs red. She walked steadily. Her ladies followed, weeping. She knelt at the block, forgave her executioner, and whispered a final prayer. In manus tuas Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. The first strike missed, the second did not. Her head was lifted for all to see, but as the executioner held it aloft, the wig came away in his hand, and the crowd gasped. Mary's once glorious auburn hair was gone. She had aged quietly in the darkness. Her real hair was thin, gray, cropped short, a prisoner to the very end. Elizabeth was told with care. She locked herself in her chambers and did not emerge for days. When she finally appeared, she claimed the execution had been carried out without her full consent. But the deed was done, and the line between mercy and necessity was erased. In the next part, we will explore the twilight of Elizabeth's reign, how the Virgin Queen faced the gathering storms of Spain, watched her youth slip away, and came to understand that even the most powerful monarch must one day walk alone into silence, for no crown can delay time forever. The year was 1588, and Elizabeth Tudor stood at the height of her power. England had changed under her long reign. The fires of religious war had dimmed, though never fully vanished. Her court shimmered with culture, poetry, and the hum of diplomacy. And the Queen herself, now well into her 50s, remained a symbol of poise and sovereignty. Her crimson gowns flowing like banners of defiance, her face powdered, her voice still sharp as a blade. But across the sea, storm clouds gathered. Spain, the mightiest empire in Europe, ruled by Philip II, once Elizabeth's suitor, now her adversary. He had watched her for years, watched her crush Catholic resistance, watched her execute Mary, Queen of Scots, watched her sanction privateers who raided his ships and colonies in the name of English freedom and Protestant faith. Now he would act. He would send an armada, and the sea itself would be the battlefield. In London, the bells rang without joy. Orders were dispatched. Beacons were prepared. Ships were summoned from ports and harbors, many small and untested, their sails patched, their cannons mismatched. But they were English, and they would sail. Elizabeth, ever the master of performance, traveled to Tilbury to meet her troops. She arrived on horseback, clad in white armor over a velvet gown, a plumed helmet resting lightly in her hand. The men had expected a figurehead. Instead, they found a general. Her voice rose across the field, steady and fierce. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. They cheered, and they believed her. The Spanish Armada appeared on the horizon in July. 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, their banners of gold and crimson fluttering in the wind. It was an invasion crafted by empire, a fleet blessed by priests designed to crush a heretic queen and restore England to Rome. But the Channel did not yield. The English ships, faster and smaller, darted like wasps around the great Spanish galleons. Fire ships lit the waters at Calais. Storms battered the formation. Miscommunication and disease spread among the Spanish ranks. The sea, it seemed, was not theirs to command. By August, the shattered remnants of the Armada limped back toward Spain, their hulls splintered, their sails torn, their crews starving. England had not only survived, it had won. Elizabeth's victory at sea became legend. Portraits were painted, her hand resting on a globe, her face serene, unshaken. She became myth in her own lifetime. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the protector of a Protestant kingdom divinely favored. But time, though briefly delayed, crept still. Her hair thinned beneath her wigs. Her teeth, once brilliant, ached in her jaw. Her closest companions began to die. Robert Dudley, her lifelong friend, her rumored love, passed away in 1588, just weeks after the Armada's defeat. Elizabeth locked herself away when she heard the news. She clutched the final letter he had sent her to her chest, and for days would not speak. She would never again allow someone so close. The court glittered still, filled with poets and suitors, music and feasts. But Elizabeth grew quieter. She aged in layers. Each year another mask, another jewel, another ruff to shield the truth of time. She danced, but less often. She laughed, but guardedly. In council, she remained shrewd, yet her thoughts sometimes drifted into silence longer than before. And always the question lingered, who would come after? She had no husband, no children. Her advisors pressed her, year after year, to name a successor, but Elizabeth would not. To name an heir was to invite factions, to welcome death's shadow, and so she ruled on, clinging to the crown as if it were part of her flesh. But the world moved forward. The 1590s brought hunger, war, and rebellion in Ireland. Spanish ships still prowled the Atlantic. Trade waned. The poet Edmund Spenser died, his dreams of an English Renaissance left unfinished. William Shakespeare rose in his place, his plays both flattering and questioning the age in which he lived. At court, younger favorites emerged. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, charming, impetuous, a man who reminded many of Dudley, gained the Queen's attention. For a time, he danced at the center of her favor. But power seduced him too quickly, and in 1601, after a failed rebellion, he was sentenced to death. Elizabeth signed his warrant with shaking hands, and when she heard the axe had fallen, she did not eat for days. She aged swiftly after that. By 1603, she was in her 70th year. Her health declined, though no illness was clearly named. She would not lie down. She stood for hours at a time, refusing her bed, as if fearing that once she rested, she would never rise again. Her ladies begged her to sleep. She only whispered, "Must is not a word to be used to princes." But the body knows what the mind resists, and eventually she collapsed. She was moved to Richmond Palace, where spring tried gently to bloom outside the frost-touched windows. She lay still, pale against the pillows, her rings removed, her crown absent. She spoke little, but those who came to her bedside said she smiled faintly when James of Scotland was named as her successor. A Stuart for a Tudor, her cousin's son, the blood of Mary, the blood of Henry, joined at last. Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603. No children wept, no husband mourned, but the bells tolled for a queen who had ruled for 44 years. England had been shaped by her hand. It would never forget her. In the next part, we shall walk through the long echo of her passing, how the courtiers who once bowed to her scattered like leaves, how her body was laid to rest, and how history began to turn her reign into legend. For death comes even to queens, but memory is harder to bury. The day after Elizabeth's death, England woke in a hush. There were no cannon salutes, no grand proclamations immediately shouted through the streets, only bells, slow and heavy, the same bells that had rung for Mary, the same bells that had echoed for Henry. But now their sounds seemed to stretch longer through the mist, as though the air itself hesitated. The Queen was gone, and the great Tudor dynasty, the house that had changed the shape of England, had ended with her. In Whitehall Palace, her ladies wrapped her body with care. She had shrunk in her final days, her once majestic form now fragile beneath the linen shroud. The crimson wigs, the pearl-draped gowns, the golden portraits, they were gone now, set aside like forgotten costumes in a shuttered theater. What remained was the silence, and a queen whose life had been spent performing strength, now cradled in stillness. It was Robert Cecil, son of William Cecil and her most trusted advisor in her final years, who carried the burden of transition. He had worked behind the scenes for months, preparing for this moment, carefully, with Elizabeth's unspoken consent. And now he sent for James, King of Scots, and soon King of England. The news traveled northward with royal haste. When it reached James VI, he received it not with weeping, but with calculation. He had waited his whole life for this moment, cautious, diplomatic, aware that he was the child of a mother executed and a cousin whose favor was ever flickering. He would not offend her memory, but he would claim her crown. While James prepared to cross the border, Elizabeth's body remained unburied. It was a full month before the funeral was arranged. The nation waited in quiet mourning. Churches held vigils, poets wrote odes. In taverns, old men told tales of the Virgin Queen and her triumphs over Spain, her long rule, her refusal to wed. Some called her saint, others tyrant, but none called her forgotten. Her funeral was held on April 28, 1603. The coffin, draped in purple velvet, was carried from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey on a hearse drawn by 4 great horses. Black plumes towered above their heads, their bridles silent and solemn. The streets were lined with thousands. Many wept. Others crossed themselves. And some, awed by the moment, simply stared. The procession stretched nearly a mile. Nobles rode in silence. Bishops chanted psalms. Children watched from rooftops, the weight of history pressing against their small shoulders. At the front of the cortege, a wax effigy of Elizabeth sat upon a throne, dressed in royal robes, her face serene and pale. A queen in death, as in life. Inside Westminster Abbey, the air was heavy with incense. The choir sang softly. The arches echoed with ancient hymns. Beneath the tall stained glass, beneath the very space where she had been crowned so many years ago, they lowered her into the earth. But not alone. She was laid to rest beside her half-sister, Mary Tudor. The two women, so different in life, now shared a tomb. Beneath the inscription, partners enthroned in grave, here rest two royal sisters. Yet time would favor one more than the other. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's image grew. Paintings of her multiplied, her hand on a globe, the armada defeated at her back, her face a pale mask of power. Poets like Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton wrote of her as England's muse. Shakespeare, whose life had spanned nearly her entire reign, crafted queens and kings with her in mind. Even her faults were folded into legend. She became more than monarch. She became myth. But the court she left behind began to fade quickly. The glittering halls of the Elizabethan court, once filled with music, dance, and the whispered schemes of courtiers, fell into new hands. James arrived with his own retinue. Scottish accents replaced English ones. New favorites rose, and the old were left behind. Many of Elizabeth's closest servants were dismissed. Her chamber was stripped, her letters stored, her jewels cataloged and claimed. Only her memory remained untamed. In the countryside, her face remained on coins and in prayers. Stories were told of how she had walked among soldiers at Tilbury, how she had refused to marry for love of her people, how she had ruled with a lion's heart in a world of wolves. Children recited her speeches. Widows touched her name with reverence. And the name Elizabeth would pass into centuries of remembrance, not just as a queen, but as a mirror to England itself. But even as her image was raised, the realm she left behind was changing. James III, the new king, sought peace with Spain, not battle. He believed in divine right, not clever compromise. He had a son and a daughter, a wife from Denmark. He spoke often of unity between England and Scotland, but he was not Elizabeth, and the crown no longer fit the same way. In the next part, we shall step into the court of the first Stuart king, where echoes of Elizabeth still linger in candlelight, and where the choices of a new monarch will unknowingly ignite the fuse of a coming storm. For while Elizabeth's reign ended in peace, the world she left was more fragile than it appeared, and peace, like legacy, is never guaranteed. The arrival of King James to the English throne in 1603 was not met with thunder or rebellion, but with a curious quiet. He crossed the border from Scotland with his retinue, ministers, guards, secretaries, and dogs, all in a slow procession that wound through the countryside like mist. He stopped at villages, was offered gifts, received blessings, and watched the English people watch him. They did not yet know what to make of him. He, in turn, studied their customs, their laws, their language. He was king now, of two kingdoms, of one uncertain future. The court he inherited had not yet cooled from the breath of Elizabeth. Her presence still haunted the tapestries, the marble floors, the very timbers of Whitehall and Hampton Court. The servants still moved with habits formed over decades of her rule. The courtiers still wore expressions shaped by her moods. But James was not Gloriana. He had no use for veils and riddles. He disliked ceremony, preferred hunting to poetry, and often spoke more plainly than his hosts expected. Where Elizabeth had crafted her image like a painting, James seemed unaware of the brush at all. And yet, he was clever, perhaps more than anyone guessed. He knew the value of appearing dull while thinking sharply. He brought with him a dream, one he would repeat again and again in Parliament, in sermons, in private meetings, and public proclamations. Union, not just a personal union of crowns, but a single nation. England and Scotland, joined not only by monarchy, but by blood, law, and name. He called it Great Britain, but England was wary. They had not asked for a Scottish king, nor for Scottish customs, and while James had their crown, he did not yet have their full trust. the court shifted uneasily. James filled his circle with favorites. The first and most dazzling was Robert Carr, a young, handsome page who quickly rose through the ranks to become Viscount Rochester and later the Earl of Somerset. His beauty charmed, his youth intrigued. But it was his closeness to the king that troubled many. Whispers filled the galleries of affection, of indulgence, of favors granted too freely. Elizabeth's court had been scandalous in secret. James's court was scandalous in daylight. Soon, Carr would fall. But before he did, another rose to take his place. George Villiers, a figure of charm, intelligence, and ambition. James made him Duke of Buckingham, and his presence at court would shape the reigns of not just one monarch, but two. Meanwhile, England's golden age of drama and poetry burned on. Shakespeare, now aging, wrote his final plays, The Tempest, Cymbeline, Henry VIII. New voices emerged, Ben Jonson, John Donne, and others who turned ink into architecture, who wrote not for glory, but for understanding. The mask of the Renaissance had not yet slipped, but behind it, cracks had begun to form. For James was not only a lover of books and unity, he was a man of firm belief. And one of those beliefs was kingship itself. He believed kings were not merely ordained by God, but above questioning, above parliament, above the law, even above history. It was this belief, this seed, that would one day split the nation, but not yet. In 1605, a plot was discovered. A cell of English Catholics, weary of persecution, angry at broken promises, had gathered in secret beneath the chambers of Parliament. They planned to strike with gunpowder, to destroy the government in a single breath, to kill the king and begin anew. Among them was a man named Guy Fawkes. On the night of November 4th, he was caught guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords. The plan had failed, but the echo of it would never fade. James responded with fury and caution. Catholics were further restricted, watched, fined. A day of Thanksgiving was declared to be celebrated every 5th of November. Bonfires, bells, effigies. Year after year, England remembered the near disaster not with silence, but with flame. The shadows of religion, once thought tamed under Elizabeth, had returned. As James grew older, his hopes for unity grew more distant. Parliament resisted his reforms, the English resisted his Scots, and his own court became thick with plots and favoritism. But he found comfort in writing, on kingship, on witchcraft, on scripture. He wrote about the nature of power, the duty of subjects, and the art of ruling with a divine touch. Few read his words with reverence, but he read them as gospel. His son, Henry, Prince of Wales, was everything James was not: athletic, admired, brilliant in spirit. The people loved him. He hunted like a warrior, spoke like a poet, and bore himself with majesty. And then at the age of 18, he fell ill. A sudden fever, a slow decline, and death. The grief was national. Streets were draped in black, poets wrote elegies, commoners wept. The hope of the next reign was gone, and in his place stood Charles, quieter, more fragile, more devout, a king in waiting, but a king of a different kind. In the final years of James's life, the court dulled. He became reclusive, plagued by gout, distracted by his books and his aches. He still spoke of union, still hoped for peace, but England had begun to murmur once more of taxes, of corruption, of divine rights and human costs. In 1625, James died. He left behind no grand victories, no empires, no golden legend, but he left a son, and in that son a spark would ignite. In the next part, we will follow the rise of Charles IV, a king born of theory, reared in shadows, and fated to become the first monarch of England to stand not above his people, but before them. For the fire that had once glowed quietly in the Tudor twilight was now ready to roar. When Charles I ascended the throne in 1625, the air of the English court grew suddenly quieter, more reserved. Where his father James had filled halls with his voice and oddities, his sprawling speeches, his affection for favorites, his appetite for attention, Charles was all stillness and silence. He was a slender man, with soft features and eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. He walked with care, spoke with precision, and seemed, even from the beginning, a monarch of another age, one untouched by laughter or disorder. But behind that calm exterior was a man forged by absence. Charles had grown in the shadow of his elder brother, Henry, the beloved prince who had once captured the hearts of the people. And when Henry died, the expectations that had once danced about him were placed upon Charles's shoulders like an iron cloak. He had been a quiet boy, slow to speak, prone to stammers. He had not flourished in crowds that nor burned with his brother's charm. But what he lacked in presence, he built in conviction. He believed in order, in ceremony, in kingship, as a divine gift, unchallenged, unshared. His marriage was swift. He wed Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, youthful and devout. The alliance was meant to soften Europe, to bind France and England in peace. But the people recoiled. A Catholic queen, in the court of a Protestant king, whispers stirred like autumn leaves. Fear of papists, of old flames relit, of England slipping back toward Rome. Charles said nothing, and so the fear grew. From the start, his reign was a dance of friction. Parliament demanded voice in matters of war, of tax, of governance. Charles, like his father, believed such things were beneath them. Matters fit for kings, not for commoners or lords who sat beneath stained glass and argued. And so in 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament. He would rule alone. What followed was 11 years of personal rule. He raised money through old fines, customs duties, forced loans. He revived laws long dormant. Ship money, once collected during wartime to fund the Navy, was demanded in peacetime from inland counties with no ships at all. It was not cruelty, it was not greed, it was control. But to the people, it felt like theft. Meanwhile, within his court, Charles built a world of elegance and formality. He filled chapels with incense and chant. He restored cathedrals with gilded carvings and stained glass. He embraced Archbishop Laud, a man of ritual and beauty, whose reforms in the church leaned toward Catholic aesthetics without Catholic theology. The Puritans were horrified. They had dreamed of a simpler faith, bare walls, open Bibles, no gold, no statues. But Charles had no patience for their plainness. He saw it as rebellion, and he would not bend. Yet rebellion would come, not first from England, but from the north, Scotland. In 1637, Charles attempted to impose a new prayer book on the Scottish church. It mirrored the English one, formal, hierarchical, ceremonial. But the Scots, fiercely Presbyterian and wary of English interference, rose in fury. Riots broke out in churches. Ministers were assaulted. Mobs stormed the pulpits. From Edinburgh to the Highlands, resistance caught flame. They formed the National Covenant, a pledge to defend their religion, their tradition, and their land from the king's interference. It was not a rebellion, not yet, but it was a warning, and Charles ignored it. To crush the Scots, he needed money, and to raise money, he needed Parliament. So in 1640, after 11 years of ruling alone, he recalled it. But Parliament was not the same as when he had left it. It was sharper now, angrier, less willing to be dismissed. The members demanded reforms, of church, of tax, of royal power. They demanded the trial of Charles's closest advisors. They demanded in truth something Charles could never grant, accountability. The king resisted. He dissolved this parliament too within weeks, but rebellion continued to stir. The Scots invaded the north of England. Armies formed. Counties bristled. The crown's strength faltered. Desperate, Charles called Parliament again. This time, he could not dismiss it. This time, it would not leave. It became known as the Long Parliament, and it would become the crucible of the king's fate. In 1641, Parliament moved faster. The Earl of Strafford, Charles's fiercest advisor, was arrested and executed. Laud followed soon after. Reforms passed. Authority shifted. And then, one fateful day, Charles did the unthinkable. He entered the House of Commons in person, flanked by soldiers. He came to arrest 5 members, but they were gone, warned, hidden. Charles stood before an empty chamber. He asked the speaker where they had gone. The reply was calm, historic. "May it please your majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the house is pleased to direct me." The king turned and walked out. It was over. Within months, England split, royalist against parliamentarian, noble against noble, neighbor against neighbor. The English Civil War had begun, and the throne itself would tremble. In the next part, we will march into that war-torn land, through muddy fields and hollow churches, where brother turned upon brother, and the divine right of kings was measured not by scripture, but by sword. For Charles believed he was chosen by God, but the people had begun to believe they were chosen too. The year was 1642, and England stood divided, not by borders, but by conviction. From the hills of Yorkshire to the docks of Devon, from the ancient cathedrals to the humblest barns, men began to choose. Not kings or countries, but sides. Some wore the king's colors, crimson and gold, riding under the banner of divine right. Others rallied behind Parliament, bearing plain sashes and steel-gray eyes, their cause not crowned, but carved from belief. It was not a war of foreign tongues. It was a war of brothers. Charles Thirst raised his standard in Nottingham that August. The royal banner flapped weakly in the autumn wind, its gold thread catching the dying light. Few answered at first. His words were lofty, calling for loyalty, for tradition, for the ancient order of things. But England was already changing. The parliamentarians, soon called Roundheads for their cropped hair and Puritan austerity, gathered quickly. Their leaders spoke of liberty, of laws made by consent, of a nation not ruled by a single will, but governed through voice and vote. At their head was a name that would soon echo like a distant drumbeat: Oliver Cromwell. The first battles were scattered and clumsy. Edgehill, Turnham Green, a clash of inexperience and caution. Farmers with pitchforks faced noblemen in plumed helmets. Cannons misfired, horses scattered. Blood spilled in muddy fields where sheep once grazed. Neither side gained ground. Both claimed victory. But in truth, the war had only begun to breathe. The king's army was proud. Cavaliers, they were called, men of high birth and flashing swords, who drank deeply, prayed softly, and fought with the charm of a fading age. Their armor gleamed, their boots thundered. They fought for crown, for chivalry, for a vision of England where monarchy reigned unchallenged. But their strength was skin deep. Their ranks were undisciplined, their funds uncertain. Charles relied on nobles to raise troops and on foreign coin to keep them fed, and always his trust lay with the wrong men. Parliament's army grew more serious with time. They trained, they drilled, they listened to sermons before battle, and died with scripture on their lips. Cromwell, rising quickly through the ranks, formed the new model army, an army not of birth, but of merit. Soldiers were promoted by skill, not title. Discipline replaced flourish. Faith replaced doubt. They moved like iron across the countryside, and they began to win. By 1645, the war turned. At the Battle of Naseby, Cromwell's forces shattered the royalist army. The king's cavalry, once proud and defiant, fled the field in disarray. His papers, filled with secret letters, foreign promises, and schemes, were captured and printed for all of England to read. Trust in the king began to wither, even among his own. Still, Charles would not yield. He fled, regrouped, bargained. He played sides, whispered promises to the Scots, to the French, to anyone who might place him once more upon the high throne. But his enemies had learned his game, and this time they played it better. In 1646, Charles surrendered, not to Parliament, but to the Scots. It was a choice of subtle treason, a final act of misdirection. But the Scots, seeing no future in keeping him, sold him back to the English for £100,000. He was taken south under guard, not as king, but as prisoner. England was not yet sure what it had done. It had fought a war, torn itself in two, spilled blood upon sacred earth, but it still had a king, and no one knew what came next. Parliament splintered. Some wanted peace, a new monarchy, a balanced future. Others, Cromwell among them, saw no peace with a man who spoke with one face and ruled with another. Charles, even in captivity, conspired. He escaped once. It failed. He signed a secret deal with the Scots, promising to impose Presbyterianism across England in exchange for an army. It came, and it was defeated. By then, Cromwell no longer saw a crown. He saw a disease. In 1648, the Second Civil War ended with another parliamentarian victory, and in that victory came a silence heavier than battle. No more illusions, no more compromise, only judgment. In December, the army marched into Parliament and removed those unwilling to act. Only a remnant remained, the Rump Parliament, and they issued something England had never seen: a trial of a king. Charles was brought to Westminster Hall in January 1649. He stood beneath vaulted ceilings, among armed guards and stone-faced judges. He refused to remove his hat. He denied the court's authority. He spoke calmly, even kindly, but his words carried little weight. The sentence was clear. He was to die. On the 30th of January, Charles first stepped onto the scaffold at Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts so that he would not shiver in the cold. He addressed the crowd. He spoke of duty, of divine right, of being the people's true servant. Then he laid his neck upon the block and whispered, "I am the King of England. I am the martyr of the people." The axe fell, and for the first time in English history, a king had been executed by his own people. In the next part, we shall walk into the shadow that followed, a kingdom without a king, a republic built in the silence of monarchy, and a general named Cromwell who rose not for glory but for order. For when thrones are broken, power does not disappear. It merely waits. When the axe fell on that bitter January morning in 1649, the silence that followed did not feel like triumph. It felt like winter. The crowd had gathered outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, held back by soldiers. Snow lay in patches along the street, muddied by boots and carriage wheels. Some wept. Others stood motionless. No great cheer arose. No chant or song. Only the soft thud of a falling curtain as Charles's head was shown to the public, then lowered from sight. Blood pooled on the scaffold, but the throne remained empty. England had executed its king, and now it had to decide what to become. Parliament moved quickly. The monarchy was abolished. So too was the House of Lords. Royal emblems were torn down. Coins bearing Charles's face were melted and re-stamped. Across cathedrals and council halls, the very notion of kingship was declared a sin against liberty. They called it the Commonwealth, a republic, a nation governed by parliament and by law. But behind it all stood one man whose voice had grown stronger with each battle, whose hands had never once touched the scepter, but who now held more power than any crowned head. Oliver Cromwell. He had not sought it, or so he claimed. A farmer once, then a soldier, then a general. Now he sat in chambers where kings once ruled, his boots resting near maps inked with the blood of civil war. He did not wear robes. He did not wear a crown, but all eyes turned to him, because Cromwell had the army, and the army obeyed. The first years of the Commonwealth were a careful balancing act. The rump parliament governed in name, but slowly it drifted, arguing over taxes, land, laws. It moved too slowly for Cromwell's liking. He believed in purpose, in purity, in divine mission. In 1653, he dissolved it with a handful of soldiers. He did not shout, he merely pointed. "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." And they did. A new government was formed, and Cromwell, reluctantly he said, became Lord Protector of the realm. Not king, never king, but with power more absolute than many monarchs before him. He ruled through ordinances and councils. He walked among preachers and soldiers. He sought to build a godly nation, a land without vice, without idolatry, without tyranny. Theaters were closed, feasts banned. Christmas itself was forbidden, too decadent, too papist. London grew quiet. The bells rang only for sermons now. But his vision was not merely spiritual. Cromwell strengthened the navy, expanded trade, and brought England into wars of commerce against the Dutch and Spanish. He sent fleets across the Atlantic. He dreamed of an English world, not ruled by kings, but by parliament and providence. And still, there were enemies. In Ireland, rebellion had never fully ceased. Cromwell marched with his army in 1649, declaring justice in God's name. What followed was a campaign of brutal efficiency. Drogheda, Wexford. Thousands died, soldiers and civilians alike. Churches were burned, executions held without mercy. To Cromwell, it was righteous cleansing. To others, it was massacre. Ireland would not forget. In Scotland, they crowned Charles II, son of the executed king, as their sovereign. Another war. Another march. Cromwell met them at Dunbar, then Worcester. Each time, the royalists were crushed. Charles fled across moors and through fields, hiding in oak trees, dressing as a servant. He would not return for a decade. Cromwell returned to London in triumph, but he returned to a nation weary of triumph. By the mid-1650s, the Protectorate had grown heavy. Cromwell tried to govern through parliaments, but they frustrated him. They questioned too much, moved too slowly, challenged too boldly. He dissolved them again and again. Eventually, some of his supporters urged him to take the crown, to become king. He refused. But the offer itself lingered like incense. He began to age. The long years of war and governance, of sermons and schemes weighed upon his frame. His once booming voice grew raspier, his eyes dulled, yet he ruled still, driven by belief, by mission. Until September 1658, a fever took him. He lay in Whitehall, the same palace where Charles had fallen, now transformed into the chamber of a soldier saint. He whispered of God, of judgment, of peace. And then Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, conqueror of kings, breaker of crowns, died. A funeral was held, grand despite his instructions, black-draped horses, long processions, a coffin laid in Westminster. But the crown he refused still waited, and the silence that followed his death was not peace. It was uncertainty. In the next part, we shall watch the dream of the Republic unravel, how Cromwell's son could not bear the burden, how old loyalties stirred in the shadows, and how the people who once cheered revolution turned back toward the throne. For England had killed its king, but it had not killed the need for one. The summer after Oliver Cromwell's death was long and heavy, as though the skies themselves were uncertain. England, exhausted by decades of war, change, and godly rule, now faced a silence too strange to bear. The Lord Protector was gone, but no jubilation followed. No crowds filled the streets, no mourning bell echoed quite loud enough to fill the void he had left behind. For though Cromwell had rejected the crown, he had ruled as king in all but name. And now there was no king, nor, it seemed, a guide. Richard Cromwell, his eldest son, stepped forward reluctantly. He had not commanded armies. He had not stood on battlefields or thundered sermons in Parliament. He had spent much of his life in the quiet corners of countryside estates, tending to accounts, avoiding the furnace of politics. But now, at his father's death, he was named Lord Protector. King whispered, not in reverence, but in jest. At first, Parliament accepted him. Courtiers bowed. Letters were sealed with his name. But the roots of Richard's power were shallow, and the soil had changed. The army did not trust him. The Republicans did not need him. The monarchists watched, waiting, and Richard, caught between forces he could neither command nor understand, wavered. In less than a year, the fragile structure built by his father began to buckle. In 1659, the army, now more politic than military, forced Richard to dissolve Parliament. It was a mistake. Power crumbled overnight. The country spiraled once more into uncertainty. New factions emerged, new assemblies formed and fell. Generals quarreled, provinces resisted. London murmured, then shouted. And across the sea in exile, Charles Stuart watched closely. For over a decade, Charles had wandered the courts of Europe, France, the Netherlands, Spain. He had worn borrowed clothes, dined on promises, listened to laughter behind closed doors. He was the son of a beheaded king, a monarch without a crown, a man whose very name had become a question. But now the question returned, and the answer had begun to shift. England was tired of sermons, of soldiers in government, of prayers shouted over policy. The people longed for music again, for ceremony, for peace, not in the soul, but in the streets. Even former parliamentarians, once devout in their resistance, began to reconsider. A king might bring stability, a Stuart might restore order, but only if he came not with vengeance, but with mercy. In 1660, General George Monk, a quiet figure stationed in Scotland, began to move south. He brought no grand banners, no fiery proclamations, only discipline, precision. He reached London without opposition, and there, beneath the same parliament that had once ordered a king's execution, he called for something extraordinary, the return of the monarchy. A declaration was sent across the sea. It reached Charles in Breda in the Netherlands. In it, he promised amnesty for most of his father's enemies, religious tolerance, and a government led not by force, but by counsel. It was a masterstroke. Enough forgiveness to earn trust, enough power retained to be feared. The people, once divided, cheered. And on May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles II entered London to a storm of applause. The streets were filled with flowers, bells rang in every steeple, taverns spilled with ale and music. After 20 years of blood and prayer, England rejoiced not for justice, but for joy. A monarchy restored, a chapter reopened, a king returned. Charles was no image of his father. He was witty, charming, irreverent. His court sparkled with artists and poets, with actresses and philosophers. He reopened theaters. He laughed at sermons. He moved with the grace of one who had nearly lost everything and now meant to enjoy what remained. But beneath the smiles, he remembered. He had seen the blade that took his father. He had read the names of those who signed the death warrant. And slowly, quietly, some of those names began to vanish. Not all were punished. Many were spared, in line with his promise. But a few, Those who had sat in judgment, those whose signatures stained the parchment of execution, were hunted. Some fled abroad, some were captured, some were brought to trial, and three, Thomas Harrison, John Cook, and Hugh Peters, were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their remains displayed as warnings. The past, it seemed, was not so easily buried. Still, Charles pressed forward. He filled the court with music, with silks, with laughter. Foreign ambassadors were welcomed. London revived. The monarchy, once feared, now dressed itself in velvet and gold. But old tensions never vanished. Religion, parliament, the ghosts of the Commonwealth, they lingered like dust in the rafters of a gilded palace. And Charles, though merry, knew that his crown sat lighter than it seemed. In the next part, we shall follow the dance of this restored court, the triumphs and tragedies of Charles II, the plague that would silence the streets, the fire that would consume the city, and the fragile peace that held it all together. For though the king had returned, the kingdom itself was not yet healed. And healing, in the shadow of a severed crown, would cost more than anyone knew. The Restoration had brought music back to England, but beneath the song was a low, uncertain note. Charles II ruled with an ease that seemed effortless, his laughter echoing down the marbled corridors of Whitehall, his wit sharp enough to disarm his critics, his court alive with color and scandal. He was a man shaped by exile, tempered by survival, and determined never to live in fear again. Where his father had ruled with solemnity and silence, Charles ruled with charm. But even charm cannot keep the world from burning. The early years of his reign passed in a strange sort of revelry. The theaters reopened, closed for 2 decades under Puritan rule. New plays graced the stage, coarse, quick, and full of the energy of a nation suddenly free to laugh again. Women acted for the first time, their names whispered with both admiration and envy. Nell Gwynn, an orange seller turned actress turned royal mistress, became the face of the king's affection for the stage. The court became a tapestry of masks and music, of perfume and promise. Diplomats exchanged letters, poets traded verses, and the monarchy glimmered like a mirror trying to forget what it once reflected. But outside the palace, the world still trembled. London had grown, cramped and crooked, its narrow lanes teeming with people and refuse. The poor pressed against the walls of wealth, and the rats, which skittered beneath the floorboards and behind the barrels, carried with them the breath of death. In the spring of 1665, it began. A single house quarantined. A red cross painted on the door. "Lord have mercy upon us," written in haste. And then another house, and another. The great plague swept through the city like a shadow on the wind. It clung to the alleys, the markets, the very air. Bodies piled faster than graves could be dug. The dead were carted away at night, bells tolling as they passed. The cries of the dying could be heard through shuttered windows. Physicians in bird-like masks moved through the streets, more symbolic than effective. Charles, under advice, fled the city with his court. They retreated to Oxford. London was left to its fear. For months, the city held its breath. Parliament was suspended. Shops shuttered. Theaters fell silent once more. And every sunrise was met with dread. By the end of the year, nearly 100,000 souls had perished, 1 in every 5 Londoners. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the plague loosened its grip. The city exhaled. But before it could begin to rebuild, fire came. It began in September 1666, in a small bakery on Pudding Lane. A spark, a flame, a gust of wind, and by morning, the heart of London was ablaze. The fire leapt from thatch to timber, from home to hall, devouring the wooden skeleton of the city. Churches burned, taverns crumbled. St. Paul's Cathedral, once proud and ancient, collapsed in a roar of stone and ash. For 4 days and nights, the fire raged. Charles rode into the city himself, coordinating efforts, speaking to citizens, offering calm. The people, who had once watched his father executed, now cheered their king as he stood among them, his face smudged with soot, his hands pointing toward water buckets and fire lines. When the flames died, over 13,000 buildings had been destroyed. But in the strange fortune of fire, the rats and their plague were gone. The old city was ash, and in that ash, Charles saw something new. He commissioned a rebuilding, not of wood and whimsy, but of stone and vision. Christopher Wren, the architect, was given the task of reshaping London. Streets were widened, buildings made uniform. St. Paul's Cathedral would rise again. this time with a dome that reached toward heaven like a benediction. A city reborn from plague, from fire, from memory. Still, Charles's crown was not without weight. He ruled a nation uneasy with religion. Though outwardly Anglican, Charles had long held Catholic sympathies. His mother was a devout Catholic, his wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, the same. He granted toleration when he could, but Parliament pushed back. Fear of popery still stalked the land, and within the court there were whispers of his brother James, Duke of York. For James was openly Catholic, and the line of succession pointed toward him. Charles had no legitimate heirs. Though he fathered many children, by actresses, duchesses, ladies of the night, none were born within the sacred circle of wedlock. The crown could not pass to a favorite, no matter how loved, and so the question lingered. What would happen when Charles died? Would England accept a Catholic king, or would it burn again? Charles never answered it. Perhaps he couldn't. He continued to rule with a careful balance, avoiding war, avoiding confrontation, smoothing tensions with laughter and delay. He lived well. He danced, wrote and read. He walked his gardens. He fed his dogs from golden dishes. And at night, he often slipped into chambers not his own. He was England's king, but also its shadow, loving, distant, unknowable. In February of 1685, he fell ill. A sudden seizure, a stroke perhaps. He lingered for days, drifting between silence and pain. And then, in a quiet moment, he converted to Catholicism. Perhaps a final gesture of belief, perhaps of loyalty, or perhaps of peace. He whispered his last words, "Let not poor Nellie starve," and then he died. In the next part, we shall enter the age of James, the Catholic king who followed the merriest monarch and whose reign would test the very heart of the Restoration. For the fire that once cleansed the city now waited at the gates of power, and the wind was beginning to rise again. When James II took the throne in 1685, the air in England did not stir with celebration, but with watchfulness. He was a king born into upheaval, raised in exile, tempered by battle. He had fought for his brother. He had governed the navy. He had survived plots, whispers, and exile. And now, at 51 years old, James Stuart finally wore the crown once taken from his father's severed head. But the country he inherited was not the England of Charles. It was wary, wounded, wise in the ways of tyranny. And James, despite all warnings, walked a path already scorched with fire. He began with strength. His coronation was grand and reverent. Nobles bowed, Parliament gathered, and the crown was placed upon his head without resistance. The people for a time gave him a cautious welcome. After all, he had promised to defend the Church of England. He had vowed to maintain liberty, but beneath the surface, few forgot his faith. James was openly, proudly Catholic, and England, after centuries of slow reformation and sudden revolution, was not ready to forget the old scars. Just months into his reign, a storm rose from the west. The Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's illegitimate son, landed in Dorset with a band of rebels, declaring himself rightful king. He wore a cocked hat in the confidence of youth, hoping to spark the old Protestant fervor of civil war. But his support was thin, his army ragged. At Sedgemoor, the king's forces crushed him. He was captured, imprisoned, and after pleading on his knees for mercy, executed. His head was displayed on a spike upon London Bridge, and the rebellion was over. But the punishment was not. Judge Jeffreys, acting under James's command, presided over the bloody assizes, a series of trials so swift, so merciless, that his name became a hiss in the mouths of mothers. Over 300 were hanged. Hundreds more were sent in chains to the West Indies. Some were whipped through villages. Others were burned. James believed he had shown strength, but the people saw only cruelty. And then came the army. James expanded it, filling its ranks with Catholic officers. He bypassed Parliament, ignored the Test Acts that barred Catholics from public office, and issued declarations of indulgence, measures that promised religious freedom but were seen by many as veiled steps toward Catholic dominance. He built a network of power rooted not in Parliament but in loyalty to the throne. It began to feel uncannily like the rule of his father, and memories in England are long. In 1688, James made a final fateful move. His Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son, a Catholic heir. Until then, the English had quietly hoped the crown would pass to James's Protestant daughter, Mary, wife of William of Orange in the Netherlands. Now, With the birth of a male heir, that future vanished. Rumors spread like wind-fed fire that the child was not the queen's, that he had been smuggled to the birthing chamber in a warming pan, that the cries of the mother were false, that this was not an heir but a plot. James did nothing to soothe these doubts. And so, the whisper turned to thunder. In the autumn of 1688, 7 nobles wrote a letter. It was short, direct, treasonous. They invited William of Orange to land in England and protect the liberties of the nation. William, Protestant and cautious, hesitated. But then he moved. He set sail with a fleet of warships and over 15,000 men, and the English watched the horizon. When William landed in Torbay, there was no great battle, no clash of armies, no burning cities. James, betrayed by his officers, watched as his support crumbled. Even his daughter, Anne, abandoned him. His army evaporated. His courtiers vanished. He fled London. Captured once, then allowed to escape again, he boarded a ship and crossed the channel. He would never return. The king was gone, and no blood had been spilled. They called it the Glorious Revolution. Parliament convened swiftly. They declared that James had abdicated the throne by fleeing. William and Mary were offered the crown, not as monarchs by divine right, but as rulers subject to law. The Bill of Rights was drafted, limiting royal power, protecting Protestant succession, enshrining Parliament's authority. A new contract was forged between crown and country, and for the first time in English history, monarchy bent its knee to the law. In the next part, we will stand beneath the reign of William and Mary, and later Anne, the last of the Stuarts, and witness the transformation of monarchy into something unfamiliar, something less absolute, more symbolic. For kings and queens would continue to rule, but never again alone. The age of divine right was dying, and a new England was being born in its shadow. The crown passed not by blood alone, but by agreement. When William and Mary were crowned joint sovereigns in 1689, the ceremony at Westminster Abbey was both familiar and strange. The choir sang, the nobles bowed, the scepter and orb gleamed beneath the vaulted arches. But there, woven into the robes and incense, was a new thread, law. This was no divine right bestowed by heaven. This was a crown offered by Parliament, accepted with conditions, and thus began a monarchy reshaped not by sword or miracle, but by pen. Mary II, the daughter of James II, ruled beside her husband with grace and modesty. She had not wanted to usurp her father. Her heart, torn by loyalty and duty, often weighed heavily in private, but she believed, as William did, that the throne could no longer be an inheritance of tyranny. William of Orange, now William III of England, was a soldier more than a king. Stern, deliberate, and deeply Protestant, he had crossed the sea not to conquer, but to preserve what he called the Protestant interest of Europe. He governed with caution and calculation. Affection was not his strength, but stability was. Together they became the image of compromise. Yet not all was still. In Ireland, James II landed with French aid, seeking to reclaim his throne by force. His supporters, mostly Irish Catholics, rallied under the green banner of loyalty and desperation. William responded with troops, marching across the emerald fields in the thunder of cannon and musket. The two armies met at the River Boyne in July of 1690. It was not merely a battle, it was a reckoning. James fled before the battle was even finished. William's forces triumphed, and the Stuart cause in Ireland shattered. The victory at the Boyne was celebrated across England. Bells rang, prayers were said, paintings were commissioned. But in Ireland, the memory was different. There, it marked the beginning of centuries of division between Protestant and Catholic, settler and native, king and rebel. The river ran red, and its echoes have never quite faded. Back in England, the Bill of Rights solidified a new order. It barred Catholics from the throne. It declared Parliament supreme in making and suspending laws. It protected the rights of subjects, freedom of speech, the right to petition, the need for consent in taxation. The monarchy was no longer an unchecked power. It was a partner in government, an institution with limits, traditions, and boundaries drawn not by bloodline alone, but by common will. Mary died suddenly in 1694 of smallpox. She was just 32. The people mourned deeply. Church bells tolled for days. Poems were written. Even those who had opposed her father felt the weight of her passing. William ruled alone thereafter, colder and more distant. He never remarried. His reign continued with war and diplomacy. Europe teetered on the edge of great conflict, and William played his part in holding alliances together. But his health weakened. He fell from a horse in 1702, and the injury worsened until infection claimed him. He died in the quiet of Kensington Palace. There was no wailing crowd, no grand procession of grief, only the end of an age. The crown passed to Mary's sister Anne, last of the Stuarts. She was soft-spoken, dutiful, and deeply conservative. She had suffered more personal sorrow than any monarch before her. 17 pregnancies, no surviving children. She entered her reign cloaked in silence and shadow. But under Anne, the kingdom would change again. In 1707, the Act of Union joined England and Scotland into a single realm, Great Britain. Two crowns became one. Two parliaments merged, and a new flag, red, white, and blue, was born. It flew over ships and steeples, over cities and fields. It marked the beginning of a new identity, a kingdom united not only by blood and treaty, but by law. Yet Anne's own bloodline came to its end. She died in 1714 without an heir. With her death, the Stuart dynasty was finished. Gone were the Tudors and the passions of Henry and Elizabeth. Gone were the Stuarts and their dreams of absolute rule. The crown now passed sideways to the Protestant House of Hanover, distant cousins from Germany, brought not for love or loyalty, but because they fit the law. In the next part, we shall watch the monarchy transform once more, how German princes became British kings, how Parliament continued to rise, and how royalty began its long journey from power to pageantry. For though the throne remained, it no longer ruled with command, but with memory, tradition, and the fragile weight of history. In the late summer of 1714, a foreign tongue echoed through the corridors of St. James's Palace. George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, arrived in England as its new king, George Thurston of Great Britain. He was a man of 64 years, stiff in posture, dry in temperament, and fluent not in English, but in German. He had never expected to wear the British crown. Yet by the logic of Parliament and the precision of succession law, he was now king. There were no celebrations in the streets, no grand cheers or banners waving. The people watched in wary silence as this stranger, selected more for his religion than for any claim of familiarity, took the throne once worn by queens named Mary and Anne. He had not known them. He would never be like them. But he was Protestant. And that, for now, was enough. The House of Hanover had begun. But it began not in glory, but in translation. George kept mostly to himself. He brought with him a tight circle of German advisors, German cooks, German habits. He read English slowly, spoke it rarely, and ruled it with the detachment of a man overseeing a distant estate. His son, George Augustus, the future George II, was more at ease with English customs, but their relationship was famously cold. Father and son lived in the same palace, but dined at different hours. They argued over everything, over titles, over money, over matters of ceremony. And yet, the monarchy endured, not through passion or personality, but through Parliament. For by now, power no longer sat in the royal chambers. It gathered across the river, in Westminster. There, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the House of Commons, ministers debated policy, budgets, treaties. The king appointed his council, yes, but more often, he accepted the figures presented to him by Parliament's will. And into this growing space stepped a man of sharp mind and long memory, Robert Walpole. Walpole understood the shifting winds better than most. He did not speak of revolution or divine rights. He did not seek to be crowned or anointed. But slowly, methodically, he became what many would later call the first prime minister. He managed Parliament. He soothed the king. He whispered advice behind closed doors and silenced opposition with favors and wit. For 20 years, he governed, and the monarchy shrank, quietly, gracefully, deliberately. George I died in 1727 on a journey back to his native Hanover. He was buried in Germany, far from the nation he ruled. His son became George II, the first monarch since 1066 to be born outside England, and the first in generations to die on its soil. George II ruled with more energy. He led troops personally at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, becoming the last British monarch to command in battle. But he too was bound by Parliament's reins. The real power still flowed through ministers, through debate, through consensus. The throne had become symbolic, respected, adorned, but no longer feared. When George II died in 760, his grandson rose to the throne as George III. He was young, British-born, fluent in English. He declared, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." The people cheered. They believed a true monarch had returned. But fate had other plans. George III's reign was long, spanning 60 years, and in that time, the world shifted beneath his feet. Across the Atlantic, colonies rebelled, taxed without voice, governed without sympathy. They rose up. The American War of Independence followed, and the British Empire watched its jewel fracture. George was painted by rebels as a tyrant. In truth, he was stubborn, but not cruel. Devout, diligent, and determined, he believed in unity and order. But he could not stop the tides. The colonies declared independence, and the empire shrank. Later in life, George suffered from bouts of madness, likely brought on by porphyria or other undiagnosed conditions. He wandered the halls of Windsor Castle speaking nonsense, unable to recognize his own family. His eldest son ruled as Prince Regent during these dark years. And though George III lived into the 1820s, the crown had already moved past him. He was king in name, but not in thought. In the world beyond, steam engines began to roar, factories rose, cities expanded, and Britain, once a kingdom of stone and sword, became an empire of industry. The monarchy, still present in ceremony, began its transformation into the symbolic power it holds today. Not absent, but distant. In the next and final part, we shall step into the final act of the crown's strange journey, from the Victorian age to the modern day. We will walk through the long shadows cast by queens and kings who ruled not with power, but with presence, whose crowns gleamed under camera lights rather than divine skies. For the monarchy, once born of battle and blood, now lives in memory, myth, and quiet pageantry. A relic perhaps, but a living one. The crown, once forged in fire and conquest, now gleamed in quiet ceremony. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, she was just 18, small in stature, reserved in demeanor, but with a sense of purpose far older than her years. Her name would come to define a century. Yet at the moment of her coronation, seated beneath the ancient stone of destiny, the monarchy was no longer a force of command. It was becoming a mirror, a symbol. And in that reflection, Britain found not tyranny, but continuity. Victoria ruled for 63 years, through the rise of railways and telegrams, factories and colonies. Under her reign, the British Empire stretched across continents. The sun never set, they said, on her dominion. But it was not the Queen who drove the wheels of empire. It was Parliament. It was industry. It was the slow machinery of a constitutional monarchy perfected over centuries of rebellion, reformation, and reform. Still, Victoria gave it face. She became the grandmother of Europe, a widow in black, a sovereign whose silence comforted a rapidly changing world. After her came Edward VII, regal and worldly. Then George V, who ruled through the storm of the Great War as gas and gunfire tore through a continent. He shed the family's German name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and became simply and pointedly Windsor. It was a gesture that mattered, because by then, the crown's survival depended not on force, but on affection. George's son, Edward VIII, learned that truth too late. In 1936, he fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The government objected, the church refused, Parliament stood firm, and the king, faced with a choice between crown and companion, chose love. He abdicated, stepped down, not in exile or revolution, but by signing a document. The monarchy bent not to a rebellion this time, but to its own quiet code. His brother Albert, known as George VI, reluctantly took the throne. He had a stammer, a shyness, a soul not made for public life. But in the darkest hours of the Second World War, he stood firm. His broadcasts rallied the people. His refusal to leave London during the Blitz bound him to the nation. He did not command armies, but he helped them endure. In 1952, his daughter became queen, Elizabeth II. She was 25, and in the decades that followed, her face would become one of the most recognized in the world. She reigned over a nation that changed more in her lifetime than in any century before it. Decolonization, television, the internet, new wars, new peace, and yet she remained still, poised, quiet. Her power was not in rule, but in presence. The monarchy had become a story, a living history. It appeared in crowns and speeches, weddings and jubilees. Its strength lay in ceremony, in the illusion of permanence. But even illusions, if believed in long enough, take on a truth of their own. In 2022, Elizabeth passed, the end of an age. Her son, Charles III, took the throne, and once again the crown passed, softly, quietly, not with conquest, not with divine thunder, but with tradition. The monarchy today lives not in palaces, but in memories. It is both relic and ritual, a golden thread in the national tapestry, sometimes frayed, sometimes gleaming, always present. No longer divine, no longer feared, but watched and wondered at. From Henry VIII and his festering wound to Elizabeth II and her silent resolve, the journey of the crown is not one of glory alone. It is a tale of survival, of reinvention, of power slowly yielding to time. And still the bells of Westminster ring, not for conquest, but for continuity. A sound once born of blood, now wrapped in velvet and echoed in pageantry. And perhaps in that soft echo lies the most enduring power of all.